chin and they've dragged him away by the hair. Corrupt from the bottom to the top, and you tell me it's the law. Davy's out on 2 weeks bail, he's down the town to score. All his offals in and he's bitten to the chin and they busted every floor. Corrupt from the bottom to the top, you tell me it's the law. Davy's down to the old grey squat and he's lying with his lass. There's a prick through the pane and he's out in the lane with the bailiffs in the glass. Corrupt from the bottom to the top, you tell me it's the law. The trial comes on a Monday morning, Davy's in the dock. He can't stop his tears, it's 2 years, you can't turn back the clock. Corrupt from the bottom to the top, you tell me it's the law. To the prison bars, and he's hung till he's clear of it all. Corrupt from the bottom to the top, and you tell me it's the law. There's a law for the rich and a law for the poor and a law for dirty Davy. His body's gone but his soul goes on. Here's to you, dirty Davy. Corrupt from the bottom to the top, you tell me it's the law.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm terribly sorry about the initial false start there. I actually believed that Pondy had the stream, and unfortunately my encoder auto-started because Vin's been twiddling with the knobs over Christmas, and he must have dropped the stream at his end, and I must have accidentally have taken up the baton from him. So, Pondy, my apologies for stealing the last few minutes of your show. Tonight's a bit of an ad hoc show for you. We have Andy Thomas, who was originally going to be the guest on Northeast Truth, but I know that the lads are having internet problems and can't hold the stream at the moment, so I'm having to sit in for them. We may have some slight interruptions because the glorious monolith, the gleaming new PC that was donated, has apparently already burst a gasket and is going AWOL on regular leaves of duty. So if we disappear from the airwaves, you will need to bear with us for a few moments while I kick and then re-kick and then reboot the PC. Andy, I'm so glad that you accepted the challenge of taking to the airwaves with me tonight.
Well, it's very nice to be here, so hello there.
And you're in my part of the country, just down in Sussex there. I'm in central London.
Oh, okay, right, yeah, not too far then.
Yeah, but, so you're not in Australia at all, like you sounded like when we first started the call.
No, it just feels like it.
Yeah, it does, it does. Okay, there's just a little message from, yes, I am streaming now. I'm terribly sorry for stealing the stream from you, Pondy. I must apologise once more. Right, okay, well, literally, like I say, this is a very last minute. Michael, I'm on air, so if you're going to... No, he hasn't come back yet, I don't think.
Who was that at the door?
I don't know, maybe it was Robert. I don't know. I'm on air. Piss off. Take the puppies with you. Sorry, I also have a house full of teenagers, which will interfere with any train of thought that you may be having. I'll do my best to mute out if things get noisy at this end. So if you don't hear me umming and hahing in acknowledgement, it's probably just simply that a riot has broken out this end of the microphone, and I'm trying to save you from that as much as possible. Okay, if you'd like to introduce yourself and kind of your field of expertise, I believe you're a published author.
Yes, I mean, over the years, I've written quite a few books, and in covering different areas. I mean, the book that I'm best known for now is a tome called The Truth Agenda. And The Truth Agenda really came out of years of giving lectures around all sorts of circuits, trying to sort of show people why there actually is something to the whole realm of, conspiracy theories, unexplained mysteries, and all of these things that are dismissed in the mainstream. And I mean, I've written books in the past about, crop circles, psychic phenomena, that was the world really that I began exploring. But what was very interesting was as the years went by, I began to get opportunities to give presentations. And of course, after a while, you start to branch out and you realize there are so many areas that people like to hear about, but the mainstream isn't going to give it a serious look in at all. And I mean, just a good example of that, just this evening before I came online here, there's Professor Brian Cox and Dara O'Brien on BBC Two, debunking UFOs.
And announcing publicly that anybody that didn't believe that the moon landings actually happened aren't welcome to watch the show.
Well, indeed, yes, which is fine, because I'd be very happy to turn it off. But
I was watching it with the sound turned down, but they hit a bit about black holes, and that just, no.
It's a very good demonstration that, I mean, it was the classic straw man technique. They were picking the weakest cases they could find, and then ripping them apart, and ignoring all of the real evidence. So this goes on all the time. Not just in UFOs, but especially in the world of, truth-seeking, conspiracy theories, if we must call them that, and I suppose we may as well, for the want of a better term. And that's what you're always up against, and therefore getting one source to start somebody with, to say, listen, don't listen to what they're saying, there is another side of the story. That's not so easy. There's loads of websites. You've got, books out there by David Icke and all the rest of it, and they're great in their way, but it's very hard to find one volume to start somebody with that tries to cover it all. So in the end, I thought I'd have a go at writing one myself, and hence the Truth Agenda was born. And so far, so good. I'm pleased to say that, the response has been very positive, and people tend to lend it round to friends and relatives who, of course, probably think they're mad, but then hopefully at the other end of reading it, they'll realise, okay, there's a case here. And that's all I'm trying to do, is to say, there's a lot of stuff out there, you hear it dismissed, you hear it laughed at, but let's look at some of the evidence. And, of course, when people do, that's when they begin to realise there is another side to all this, as you well know, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly one of the answers that I've got to the issue of the kind of meme that's now attached to the title Conspiracy Theory is to turn that around and call it coincidence theorising.
Well, I mean, yeah.
I theorise on just exactly how much of a coincidence it would be for X, Y and Z fact to all be.
Yeah. I mean, on a personal level, I've now got used to being described as a conspiracy theorist, and I'm now taking the approach that the Quakers took back in the 1600s.
You're embracing the term.
Brief bit of religious history. So they were officially founded by a guy called George Fox, and they called themselves the Religious Society of Friends. And as an insult, people said, look at you, pathetic bunch, quaking in the sight of God. And so suddenly they thought, all right, well, maybe we do. So we'll call ourselves the Quakers. And in adopting a term that was actually intended to be insulting, it kind of diffused it. It took the energy of the insult out of it. And now we know them as the Quakers. But we should always remember that it was a term of abuse. So similarly, if somebody says you're a conspiracy theorist, well, A, point out to them that's because there's lots of conspiracies out there worth theorising over.
Yes.
And B, do you even know what a conspiracy theorist really is?
Well, this is it.
Actually, most people don't.
Yeah, well, I would normally point out that a conspiracy is two or more men conspiring to enact a deed, and a theory is a selection of thoughts gathered together around the musings of those two or more men. So.
Yeah, and what is wrong with that?
Yes.
Exactly right. So if you look at the
it's hardly proof of insanity, is it?
The dictionary definition makes it clear that the world is full of conspiracies, full of theories around them, and therefore it's a perfectly legitimate thing to be a conspiracy theorist. So, I think we should stop worrying about being branded that and get on with it. The problem that we have is that the term's bandied about in the mainstream as an insult without the general population really knowing what the dictionary definition is. But as soon as you show them, of course, the objections end, because you've only got to look back through history to realise that, the history of the world is a history of conspiracy theory from year dots to the present day, and it doesn't take much to prove that.
I like Robert Anton Wilson's quote from the very start of the Illuminatus, where he states that the history of mankind is the history of warfare between secret societies.
Yeah, very good. Well, as many people would, of course, go along with that.
I think it may have even been a quoted quote, but that's where I got it from, so I'll give him credit for that one.
That'll do. But, the more that you learn about history, the more you see the same patterns again and again. And so for people in the media or whatever to turn around and say, well, it couldn't have happened today, is just insane. I mean, you're not looking at the reality of the world that we're living in. And so, then when I hear scientism creeping in and good old Professor Brian Cox suddenly putting a boot in over UFOs this time, it's usually...
but he's such a pretty scientist. He looks so good on camera.
Yes. Which I think counts for a lot for him. He's unusual. He seems to be, a kind of a nice young man, relatively speaking, who's a bit quirky. But that, I think, is being used to allow him too much time to demolish other people's beliefs without actually having any justification to do so. And he does the classic, let's attack the straw man approach, which, of course, Richard Dawkins has done before him. So this is what we're always up against, and sadly they get a lot of airtime, whilst the likes of us are here, on, shall we say, not quite as big stations.
Or perhaps not quite as big stations, but I must stop you there. Our current count on the TNS map is 134 countries. I think that even stands toe to toe with the goddamn BBC, in my honest opinion.
All right. Well, maybe I'm doing ourselves down here. But anyway, the other point I'm making is
we may only have a limited number of listeners on any given occasion, but all of the shows are all podcast, and the podcast libraries are just, routinely distributed. So.
Which is fantastic, because of course that's what really needs to happen, because the mainstream simply does not reflect what people really think. And over the years, giving lectures to all sorts of groups, and not just alternative groups, everyone from Rotary clubs to the Women's Institute. If they want to hear about this stuff, I'll go and talk to them about it. It's amazing how quickly they will just sit there and kind of nod sagely and say, yeah, I can see there's a truth to that. Or, they're more open-minded, certainly, than you would think from the way people describe, the average person. In fact, if you look at the polls, and I'm sure you're aware, just a few months ago, when they had the 10th anniversary of 9/11, the global polls put together now show that over 50% of the world's population does not believe the official story of 9/11. So actually the people that believe the official story are now in the minority. So
and they all have reading ages of under 12.
Well, maybe so, but there's a...
Well, that's essentially what the mainstream media relies on, is that the dumbing down of the population has been so complete through the pernicious application of the modern education system that essentially most people leave school without the ability to construct a rational thought of their own.
Well, or at least they are coming out not being trained to question things. That's the problem. We need to be able to have reasoned analysis of anything, and for it not to be off topic. This notion there are certain things you don't discuss in polite society has led us up a very bad cul-de-sac.
Yeah, well, I do my very best to break as many taboos as I can on most of my shows, so...
Well, fantastic. That's what we need to do, of course.
Okay, well, look, do you want to just give us perhaps a potted resume of your most popular book to date?
For sure. Well, I mean, The Truth Agenda is, its subtitle is Making Sense of Unexplained Mysteries, Global Cover-Ups and Prophecies for Our Time. So it's a convoluted but fairly accurate description of what you get inside. And what I'm trying to do is to pull the threads together between some areas that some people don't always realise are related. I mean, so you've got a book of 4 parts, basically. The first part looks at the basics of, why it is that people are questioning the world they live in, giving some examples of things that are completely dismissed in the mainstream, whether it be alternative Egyptology or belief in at least some crop circles and all of this, looking at why they're debunked and just putting the case, look, there is evidence here to be looked at. Whatever you conclude at the other end of it, let's look at it. Let's not say we're not allowed to discuss this stuff.
I'm not listening is definitely a mantra of the mainstream media, isn't it?
For sure, yeah. And also, of course, you've got, on the other side of that, you've got this bizarre world we live in where actually some people in positions of power, let's put it like that, actually believe some pretty weird things themselves. I mean, if you just look at, the current Pope, I mean, he is extremely fascinated in the apparitions which occurred at Fatima in Portugal in 1917. If anybody doesn't know, it is said that a female being that many take to be the Virgin Mary, appeared to thousands of people. There are photographs, there are accounts of this going on, and Cardinal Ratzinger, as was before he became the current Pope Benedict, now, he basically spent years investigating this for the Vatican, and he was the one that verified the Fatima apparitions as an official miracle, which is interesting because what came out of that were prophecies which were given to 3 shepherd children, and the prophecies spoke basically of big things coming up. 2 of which have come to pass. One was a prediction of a Second World War, another was a prediction of the Cold War, and the third secret of Fatima was basically hidden for many years. And then the Vatican tried to dismiss it and said that all it was a prediction of the assassination attempt on John Paul II in 1981, but that doesn't fit with all the clues that were dropped by people like Cardinal Ratzinger, which said that actually it was about a huge shift, a huge change to the planet and to our way of thinking, and it was all very sort of big and devastating. Now, he's gone very quiet. He won't discuss it anymore. And yet, he clearly, in his own personal core belief, he must believe that we're now entering times where some of that's going to come true. And so that then, of course, has resonance with other world leaders, like George W. Bush was a good example of people with very deeply held religious views that we're just about to enter the end times and all of this. And even if you dismiss it as a load of rubbish, of course the danger is when you have people in power who do believe it, there's going to be a temptation for them to try to make it happen. And I believe that agenda's not gone away today. It's certainly not in America.
Yeah, this is, I mean, if I can just stop you there, this is something that I think people do need to bear in mind, is that a lot of this conspiracy theory stuff does go into some fairly dark territory and into some fairly unbelievable avenues, but that in some respects it doesn't matter what we believe out of that stuff. It doesn't matter if we believe in Satan or if we believe that there's occult power to be held in rituals and stuff like that. It's the simple fact that they appear to believe this that's the really alarming part.
Yes, well, exactly right. And of course they are in positions where they influence an awful lot of people. So I go into that in the book as well, but to make the point that the very kind of beliefs that get ridiculed in the mainstream, actually, well, some of the people that are pulling the strings have even weirder beliefs. And it's almost as if we're being warded off going into those areas, whereas it's okay for them, through their whatever occult beliefs, the secret society stuff, all the rest of it, it's okay for them to indulge fully. but it's almost as if they're trying to keep us away from that. So, making that point, you're then going to looking at some things that we are told happened one way, and then trying to demonstrate that, of course, they must have happened another way. So I use 3 examples. One is the whole weapons of mass destruction debacle, which everybody knows the basics of, and yet you will be amazed how many people don't really put 2 and 2 together that we were clearly lied to. Then I take what seems like the extreme conspiracy theory about the moon landings. And I actually use that in the book, The Truth Agenda, because there is probably a middle ground here. Because anybody that can look at some of those photographs and say that they are all real in the face of some very serious anomalies in those photographs, I think is not seeing the truth. Now, I can't tell you whether we went to the moon or not, but there are enough people with a lot of photographic expertise, people like David Percy, Marcus Allen, Mary Bennett. There's a lot of people out there who know their stuff. As soon as they point out an anomaly, you can see it for yourself. You go, oh yeah.
To be quite honest, I think as far as the moon landings go, I think the 2 pieces of footage are actually video footage that really give the game away the most. One of them, everybody will have seen the footage, but most people may not have seen the leaked footage, which is of the way that the Earth, apparently from midway between the Earth and the Moon, was shot through the LEM window, and the leaked footage shows them using a piece of card to create the effect of semi-occluded Earth in the distance, when in fact it was the window was fully lit with just a small portion of the Earth. And once you realised how they've made that footage, you cannot look at the supposed footage of them being halfway to the moon ever again without seeing that it's just simply a small patch of the planet going by under a very local window.
Well, and of course, I mean, the footage of them actually on the moon, allegedly itself, there's a lot of very interesting bits. There's one famous bit where the astronaut kind of stumbles, and then he's sort of momentarily suspended as if on a cable. Now, even in low gravity, that's not going to happen.
No, and I mean, to be quite honest, and again, people will say, well, how on earth would they have mocked up all of that footage? Well, all of that footage would have been mocked up in perfect, genuine service of a real moon landing in the practice runs on Earth, which they would have done with
variations on the theory as to how it
but the other real corker for me, especially coming from an engineering background and specifically from mechanical engineering and cars and petrol engines, heat engines of all sorts, is the exhaust flames of the Saturn V rocket. If you had a car that was putting out orange flames like that, you would certainly be wanting to run it in for a service pretty bloody quick. Just to explain to people, a hot flame is a clear blue flame, and if you look at all modern rocketry, anything that's meant to do the job that it's claimed to do, it will have a real clear blue flame coming out of the exhaust. Look at the Saturn V; that thing was running on choke. If that was a hot rod, it had 3 cylinders disconnected.
Well, and of course the other issue about the exhaust is in the footage taken in space or on the moon, it's very interesting. I mean, there's the famous shots of the lunar landers then taking off from the moon, and allegedly an automatic camera follows it up. Yeah. There is no flame, there's nothing, there's no glow. Now, those vehicles supposedly use exactly the same fuel that the shuttles used. And if you look at footage of the shuttles in orbit, which we pretty much do assume they were up there, you can see when they are firing. You can see the exhaust, and yet exactly the same fuel, funnily enough, on the lunar missions doesn't seem to produce anything at all. So, these are just some of the many, many anomalies.
And the stated, because of course all of the performance figures for all of the equipment is now available because of the Freedom of Information Act and the length of time since the actual the contracts were issued to manufacture the parts, but that rocket motor that was supposed to separate the lunar lander module from the lunar return module had a 1 in 5 success rate.
Well, as I understand...
On Earth, it had a 1 in 5 success rate, so you would have been sending man to the moon with a fairly firm knowledge that within, the first or second landing, you would probably not, you'd go to fire it and it would sit there as a dud.
Well, as I understand it, I don't think there was a single successful test of the lunar lander in earthly conditions, as it were. Not a single one. I mean, Neil Armstrong himself nearly got killed when one of them flew out of control. And yet, mysteriously, bar Apollo 13, and therein lies another tale, they all suddenly worked perfectly when they got to the moon, which is kind of odd, really. So, as I say, at the end of the day, I have to leave it up to people to make up their own minds, because I can't prove we didn't go to the moon, but you can certainly prove that the evidence which says we did is highly flawed. Well, that's very important to show people.
Well, like you were saying, there probably is a middle ground, and that middle ground is very possibly that the crews that we were being presented with were simply a stage dressing for an operation that was underway, but was known to not be able to complete the second part of the operation, which was to bring the man back alive.
Well, indeed. I mean, there are other versions, of course, which say that we've been routinely shuttling back and forth to the moon, actually quite happily, but they can't show us that because that would give away
the vril-based technology. I'm quite.
Say we've never been.
I'm quite a holder with the Nazi UFO theory. I'm quite convinced by the photographic evidence. I was actually very struck by somebody had assembled a YouTube video where they had simply taken photographs of UFOs, photographic evidence of UFOs, and had put it on a timeline, so you could see each of these photographs of UFOs in a chronological order. Yeah. And you could see that the very first ever photographs of UFOs, they look like bloody steam engines. They look like they should have half-inch steel rivets holding them together. Yeah, and then you literally see this development, the perfecting of the aerodynamic airframe, and then the move from disc-shaped objects to triangular-shaped objects, and it just simply looks to me like an Earth-based technology.
Well, listen, I'm willing to believe that there are some objects flying around that we can't explain, but certainly some of it is clearly man-made secret technology. But maybe, if some people are to be believed, they are basing it on technology that they have observed from other places, and that we can't say for sure. But one thing is clear, there are certainly weird things flying around.
Yeah.
We just don't really understand what they
agreed.
are. To deny, as some do, that it is going on. It is foolish, because there are too many sightings. I mean, over the years, I've personally spoken to several airline pilots, commercial pilots, ex-military, and they'll all quite happily tell you about the amazing things they've seen flying around. So, just to say, oh no, UFOs don't exist, that's the usual thing you hear.
And funnily enough as well, somebody was just mentioning, somebody just put it as a flippant comment in the chat box there, that they'd seen a UFO last night, but they didn't want to talk about it. As if, sort of everybody that's saying that they saw a UFO but are saying that they don't want the publicity is really publicity seeking. Well, I can assure you, sorry, I can't be bothered to scroll back up. I can't remember who it was that put the comment in. Absolutely fine comment. Sorry, I'm not slating the comment at all, but there is this kind of presumption in the public mind that people telling extraordinary stories are telling them for the purposes of gaining some sort of notoriety of sorts, even if it's only with their peer group. Well, I personally am contacted on a fairly regular basis by people with the most extraordinary, toe-curling stories, and yet they will not want me to bring them to air. They are coming to me simply because I'm a public voice, and people kind of know me for not being blinkered or bigoted or small-minded. So they bring me these extraordinary stories simply because I'm the only person that they've ever told them to.
Yeah. I find the same when you give a lecture and you're standing up there talking about things that are more outlandish than they've ever heard before. Of course, people feel safe to share stuff with you. And the amount of people that have come up to me and then told me about a UFO they've seen or a ghost or whatever it may be that they've experienced is quite extraordinary. And these are not stupid people. Many of these are up there in sort of the class system doing intelligent, sensible jobs. Do you know what I mean? They're not out for any sensationalism. They're not trying to make a name for themselves. And some of them are even embarrassed by what they witness because they don't feel they can share it without being ridiculed. And of course, that's the problem. The world that we've built around us makes people feel they cannot express these things. And that, of course, is what's so wrong. So when they find someone like you or me or anybody in this kind of world, of course, suddenly they feel safe to express it, but they might not still want to go public with it. But there are so many sightings out there. This is when you realise that, even if you dismiss 2/3 of them as maybe mistaken identity, that it was the planet Venus or it was some weird plane, you've still got a significant amount of cases you just can't explain that way.
Oh, okay. It was Mike the Fish who put that comment in, and he wasn't actually being that flippant. He says, as it happens, I actually did. I was dropping my lad and his mate home. I thought it was a helicopter at first until it passed overhead and then vanished. I'm being honest, I did have a few spliffs, but my lad and his mate said they could see it too. Either a UFO or good weed, not too sure.
But the thing is,
See, even the TNS chat box is a place that people feel that they can open up and tell people things that they wouldn't normally say to their fellow man.
Yeah, and yet that's sad, isn't it? Why should it be that way? We should surely feel that we can share anything that has happened to us. If we have a personal experience or a feeling, we ought to be living in a world where you can just happily say that. Yet, that's not been the case. And yet, as we said with the 9/11 polls, it is turning. People are beginning to feel more and more that they're not alone. And obviously, things like the internet have linked people together and made them feel not so lonely with these views, to the point where in some areas they're becoming the majority. And in the Truth Agenda book, inevitably I then use 9/11 as a perfect example of something that we've all been told one version of, but you look at the facts of what happened, you look at the many, many different accounts of what went on, and at the very least you can categorically demonstrate that we've not been told the truth about it. This will be old hat to you and probably most of your listeners, but there are people out there who've sort of heard people question it, but they think it's bonkers. But you only have to sit them down for a few minutes and give them a few basics. And actually, it's amazing how quickly people will, again, they'll kind of nod and go, now you say it, it did always seem a bit weird. So they have got their own minds. We should never forget, people often just have not had the opportunity to hear this information.
And we really shouldn't dismiss as well the hypnotic nature of the mainstream media as well, because I was already a confirmed conspiracy theorist, shall we say, out and proud, when 9/11 happened. And I remember watching it on the day, knowing damn well that it was most likely a false flag event, but still being so caught up in the theatre of it.
Yes.
It was almost impossible not to be captivated by it, and even to the degree of, World Trade Center 7, which most people just completely forgot about. Even I have to admit to being guilty about completely being sidelined. The whole Building 7 issue was just completely obscured from my thinking for a number of years until I began to re-research it. Sort of probably pick it up again 5 years later.
I think that's a very human response, to be honest.
The one thing that I am quite pleased about was that I did understand why it was a good day for bad news the day before, and kept in mind the Rumsfeld announcement on the Pentagon lawn the day before of having misplaced $2.3 trillion from the Pentagon budget. And
yes,
then,
that
of
did
course,
rather get lost, didn't it?
Yeah. I think it slipped out of his back pocket when he was bending down, picking up some of those. No, it doesn't work, does it? A few truckloads of dollars, perhaps, there. But
I think it was all right to get caught up in the human drama of 9/11 because I think we should never forget, despite the fact we have different views about who caused it, that the human drama and the suffering was real. Now that was real, whatever was behind it, and I think the emotion that people feel when they watch the towers come down, or whatever it is, there are people dying there. Do you know what I mean? You can question it every angle, but...
Well, I actually wonder if that was its modus operandi. I actually believe that 9/11 was initiated as a means of certainly traumatising a large part of the American population, but possibly even traumatising a large part of the world.
For sure, which of course it did, and I think they were banking on that would be
Andy, I'm very sorry, our Skype connection is breaking up appallingly. Let me just check that it's not bandwidth problems.
Okay.
It's clearing up again. Okay, we'll push on with that. I think we're okay for the minute.
Okay.
But we may, if sometimes Skype does this, if it does cause us problems, we'll just simply hang up and call back in, and it should clear the line. Okay, so sorry. You were saying about 9/11 and
making that point. What happened in 9/11 was genuinely dramatic, and of course I think the powers that be were banking on the fact that that would obscure people asking questions about it, as I think for many years in many people's minds it did. But as that emotional attachment begins to fade and people begin to hear more and more very sensible and sometimes quite public people questioning it, of course they begin to look at it in a different light. And now it, I think, is not as shameful as it once was to actually ask questions about it, as the polls now demonstrate, which is very healthy indeed.
Yes, I mean, certainly anybody that was questioning it within the first few years would have anybody in the room jump on them as are you know what I mean, think about the names of, you know what I mean, defaming the memories of the dead.
Yes, disrespect.
Yes, and that's been rolled out so painfully, you know what I mean, on everybody, that even the most sentient of discussions on the topic have been able to be completely overridden by that simple meme being rolled out time and time again.
Well, I mean, just a few months ago, on the anniversary, I was on Sky 200, the Edge Media TV, and I did a special with Ian Crane and Alex G, basically discussing 9/11 for 3 hours. And sure enough, one of the first emails that comes through is, how dare you, defame the memory of these poor people that died. And I mean, as we stated then, and I'll say it again, to me it's more disrespectful to the memories of the people that died not to get to the bottom of what really happened, because you don't want it to happen again. And if we all turn blind eyes and pretend there's nothing wrong with the official story, that is going to make it more likely that such things will be tried again. And of course, that's not what we want. So, no, to me, it's more respectful to want to get to the bottom of what really happened rather than less. But you're absolutely right. It was used for a long time to basically silence discussion about it, which I think was very wrong.
Yeah, certainly. And I think you're saying about them not rolling it out again. Well, again, this is the reason for becoming, or the reason for wishing to become informed about historical matters of conspiracy, is that it would appear that the conspiracies that have worked in the past are the pattern which is then used in the future. If something's not broke, why fix it? Appears to be their kind of mindset.
Well, I think that's what's different about these times, though, because, of course, with the advent of, to call it the alternative media, for want of a better term, of course, now people are looking back. They are seeing the patterns. They're realising, the resonance with certain tricks that are being played on us today, with very old ones. And, of course, this is new. That new awareness has led to programs like this and all the other people around the world who instantly now leap on anything that smells of a previous kind of similar plot. And we've never had that before. That's what's new about these times. There
is an element of that, though, that I'm slightly concerned about, because I now find that almost every world event has conspiracy theorists crawling over it with such fine tooth combs that their musings almost become comical to the casual reader. and that as conspiracy researchers, I suppose, it perhaps falls upon us to make sure that A, our reasoning is intact, and B, that our qualification of what we're saying is a logical extraction from that what it is that we're researching about.
Well, I totally agree. And I mean, that's where discernment, of course, has to come into it. Because the problem you get, of course, when you start to question everything, is that you can get into the habit, basically, of disbelieving anything that you're told any time. And that's not always fair. As we were using the term earlier on, there's often a middle ground to this stuff. And, yeah, when you just scream at people that they mustn't believe that, and obviously it's all rubbish, at the end of the day, people just switch off. Nobody would respond to that kind of thinking. And I think the conspiracy world has been a little bit guilty of that, shaking the fist at everyone around them, saying, why won't you believe me? Which, of course, isn't going to get anywhere. You have to be calm, stay reasoned, be discerning, and be willing to be compassionate to other people's views that may not agree with yours. And I think people are very frightened.
I think also possibly being prepared to tone down your message according to the audience as well, because certainly one of the things that really gets up my nose at the moment is the chemtrail issue. And I entirely hold that there is a lot of good research being done into the subject, and I wouldn't for 1 minute want to detract from any of that, but I would suggest that very little of it would amount to proof that you could hold up in a court of law. And yet, in the meantime, if you go out into any garden in any day with a simple photographer's light meter and measure the lumens coming in from the sky at the beginning of the day, and measure them again at midday, and then measure them again in the evening, it will be quite clear how much of the sunlight that you should be receiving from your natural sky during the course of the day is being occluded by the output of the exhausts of planes, regardless of their content and regardless of what the overarching plan is of releasing such emanations from the backs of planes. I mean, personally, my feeling is that it's actually, having been fascinated by the sky overhead, having spent many summer afternoons as a child laying on my back in the garden, watching the planes go overhead, watching them lay contrails, watching them disappear or blow across the horizon long before there was ever any suggestion that there was such a thing as chemtrails. And in my opinion, I have simply seen the contrails become more prevalent as the height of domestic aircraft has increased. I mean, now your modern inter-European jet that would normally fly at very low altitude and be very lowly pressurised will now be flying up in the stratosphere to save on jet fuel. And
I think you raise a very important point there, and like you, I can see there is genuine concern for some of what's going out into the atmosphere, and we know there have been experiments seeding the atmosphere, doing all sorts of things. So I think dubious things do go on. But we've sort of got to the point now where any contrail or anything that somebody may not have seen before because they're not meteorologically aware or whatever is instantly plastered up on Facebook as an anomaly. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But again, the tone that go with it is, look what they're doing. They're trying to murder us. Unfortunately, to those people that do know a little bit more about things like that, of course, it is going to be ridiculed instantly. And that is a good case where we need to just hang back a bit, try to get a sense of, okay, what's normal anyway? And you've just given one reason there.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Regardless,
why maybe there are more trails in the sky. Now, that may not explain all of them.
Regardless of the content of the emissions from the planes, surely the simple, if we as campaigners want to get it stopped and get it highlighted, and the chemtrail aspect of it is making it a subject of ridicule, if you can just simply say to every single flower grower in the country, every single farmer, look, this is cutting your lumens that's hitting your square metres of land by 25%. Over the course of the day, that is 25% less cellulose production that is available to your crop. That's money in your pocket. you'll soon get an awful lot of support for your campaign.
Well, yes, because, I mean, you're tapping in there to a genuine environmental concern. And, I mean, I find it interesting that, so much attention in the mainstream's gone on the whole man-made global warming debate, and yet there are so many other areas that actually are of more concern and are not so conjectural, whether it be the acidification of the oceans or whatever, and they're barely talked about at all. Virtually nothing by comparison, and yet these things are extremely serious. So this is where you have to wonder whether there is a big distraction going on to focus everybody's minds on just one or two little compartments so that they don't see the bigger picture. We have to be very careful not to be too sucked into that.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly anybody that's still in the man-made climate change camp, I love pointing towards the Russian research that has shown that the electromagnetic bow wave, the plasma bow wave that the solar system creates as it's travelling through the galaxy, has multiplied a factor of 10 times. So it's 1,000% thicker now than when they first started measuring it.
Well, I mean, if you look at the general changes which are occurring to our solar system, you realise that whatever we're going through now is really very little to do with what's just happening down here on Earth. There is a wider effect, you're absolutely right. And as I understand it, that the heliosphere, as well as thickening, is also shrinking. So yes, the outer edge of it is thickening, but at the same time it's shrinking down. This is a part of the cycle of the sun. The sun creates that heliosphere. We, have only been recording this for a very short period of time, so we don't know what the cycles are. But of course, there is every chance that the climate is going to change quite dramatically every now and then because of that alone and because of what our neighbouring star is doing, never mind what we're putting out there. But of course, at the same time, that doesn't mean, therefore, we should be destroying anything we want into the atmosphere. This is the point. You have to try to discern what are the real reasons to be concerned rather than the bogus ones, so that we can actually engage with issues that do need addressing. But yeah, I mean, the whole man-made global warming thing, of course, is something that I think, again, a majority of people, certainly in Britain, if you read the polls, now do not believe. But if you listen to the BBC, you wouldn't particularly get that idea,
Yeah.
So they're still putting out the raw propaganda as if it were proven, and of course it is far from that.
I actually find it quite entertaining watching the BBC and reading through the propaganda. I believe that there's actually an awful lot of contributors to BBC programmes that are currently fully aware of the propagandising that is going to be done to their material, and they appear to be slipping all sorts of things in. I've seen the most fascinating stuff about the history of law and the structure of society and money in historical Britain in a programme about children through the ages.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this was nothing at all to do with the children's lives at all, and yet it was there. It was all laid out. If you had the ears to hear what was being said, you knew that there was more being said than what the programme makers would have put on the boss's desk to say, "Here's your programme, sir."
Well, I think this is what the Truth campaigner Tony Gosling has long said when he's got links to the media himself, is that a lot of these people working for the media and in journalism know that there is another side that they're not supposed to discuss. So they have to try to find ways to work it in a way that nobody notices. But, I don't know how long that's sustainable for before the whole edifice just collapses in on itself. But no, I mean, this is the problem. And certainly with the BBC, which until recent years anyway has been greatly respected, it is a propaganda tool, and people begin to see that for themselves. But nobody seems to learn any lessons. If anything, the propaganda seems to get worse. And certainly when they put out their programs like the Conspiracy Files, which will create a shudder amongst several listeners, I'm sure. They exist to debunk. They are debunking propaganda tools. They have no interest in the true bigger picture, and their treatment of 9/11 and 7/7 and all of that, I think, is indicative of that.
Well, again, they're one of the models that most people can use if they haven't already come across this, is if they're watching any of these conspiracy shows. Is to, I mean, I'm a cameraman. I work in the commercial AV tech field, And one of the things that is really glaring is the use of camera shots for the conspiracy theorists and for the mainstream scientists. The mainstream scientists will always be sitting in an office. They'll always be sitting behind a desk. They'll always be filmed in a square portrait head and shoulders shot. Yeah. Whereas the conspiracy theorist will usually be shot through a glass bottle, off to one side in a green light with the camera at sort of a slightly jaunty 23-degree angle with it wobbling about from side to side.
That's about it, yeah.
Now, once you've actually got that in mind, go back and watch those programmes that you've all seen so many times, and it becomes absolutely hysterical watching the way that the meme, the way that the mindset is constructed without even words. If you turn the sound down and just watch for what they're doing with the programme making, and this is something that is possibly a good piece of advice if you suspect anything of being a propaganda machine, is simply turn off the sound and just sit and watch what they're trying to do with the images.
Well, I think that's completely true, and there are some other kind of little things that they do as well, which are even less subtle than that. I mean, one of the classics, a few years ago, and I recount this in the Truth Agenda book, I was on the One Show. Now, the verdict of the official inquiry into the death of Princess Diana had been announced, and of course it said there was nothing dubious going on, it was just an accident. And yet the polls were showing that most people still didn't believe that. So the article was, why is there still conspiracy theory? Why do people still believe, in general, in conspiracy theories? So, of all people, I was interviewed with Kelvin Mackenzie, ex-Sun editor, of course, along with Marcus Allen and John Wickham, UFO researcher.
Okay.
And so we were sat down in a very nice hotel, and we recorded like a 3-hour discussion, and actually it was quite interesting, and Mackenzie wasn't too sceptical. And then, of course, you know that much of that will be lost in the edit. You expect 2 or 3 minutes is all that will remain. When we actually watched it, I think there was a full 28 seconds left where we more or less just about got to say our names, and that was it. And yet they were quite happy to cut back to the studio, where they then more or less sort of made fun of us for about 6 or 7 minutes. So That is the thing. The dice is loaded against people who question the status quo. It's loaded against them from the start, not only, as you say, in the way visually they're presented, but in the simple time that they're allocated. And we also, because we weren't in the studio sitting with them, we had no comeback. There was nothing you could say to respond to what they were saying. And that is, of course, the way that it works all too often.
And to be quite honest, had you have been in a Q&A session, a live Q&A session, then they simply use the master controls over the audio to cut your microphone, or the presenter in the studio will simply shout you down and prevent you from saying anything.
Well, there's that. And also, of course, people have been conditioned anyway to laugh at anybody that talks about these things. I thought it was very interesting in the wake of the riots last year, when BBC One's Question Time was discussing the riots special programme, and one very brave lady actually, and this did go out on air, actually said, well, in my view, the police stood back, they let this happen, and the reason I think they let it happen is because they wanted an excuse to bring in tighter restrictions, more laws, which, of course, many listeners to this will agree with. And, of course, the reaction from the audience was rubbish, laughter, derision. And the panel didn't even bother to respond, So this very brave person said something that actually a lot of people think, and the response of the audience, they were conditioned just to basically make fun of her. And the fact that nobody on the panel responded and nobody picked that up speaks volumes. So we are, again, sidelined, unfortunately, by that kind of treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. The Question Time format has been used for that over many years. There's been so many protesters managed to get their voice on that show, only to then have it either ridiculed, ignored, or just simply, just not discussed.
Yes. But what is interesting, though, is to see that it's almost as if, people, that they do it to themselves. That audience had just been programmed to laugh at anybody that talks about such things. They weren't thinking about what she was saying.
No.
There was no presentation of the evidence because she wasn't given a chance to. And just the panel, it was the blank looks. It was almost as if, even in their minds, it wasn't, we better not think about it. It was they'd already been pre-programmed just to go, what? Next. It was just non-comprehension. And so that's, of course, been a very clever part of what's blocked out this kind of discussion for all these years.
You mentioned something a few minutes ago about the edifice crumbling, and I'm certainly minded that the edifice is an edifice of lies, and that if you're going to maintain a lie, especially a big one, then it has to be maintained on a daily basis with a constant feed of lies that people are going to be prepared to believe. And that with the political and intellectual awakening of the masses that Zbigniew Brzezinski has spoken about being the biggest threat to the New World Order, I think that possibly that edifice literally is crumbling, that it's no longer possible to patch the holes quicker than a new one is torn open.
Well, yes, I think that is true. And what is quite astonishing, though, is how big the lies can be and still nobody call the mainstream on it. I mean, the classic example was when, Libya was finally falling apart and the BBC broadcast supposedly live images from Green Square, supposedly showing people celebrating the fall of Gaddafi. Now, this was before it was known for sure that he was falling. Until, of course, the people watching it suddenly realised that actually the people in that square looked a little bit sort of Indian. And oddly enough, the flags they were waving looked a bit Indian because it was in India, and it was an Indian protest, and it was nothing to do with Libya at all. And yet that was broadcast as supposedly live pictures from Libya. It was plainly propaganda. They were trying to make people think Gaddafi was about to fall. There were complaints and that, but as far as I'm aware, there was no apology,
retraction,
no explanation, and they just acted as if it had never been broadcast.
I mean, I was actually, I noticed that the mainstream media wasn't actually covering in any accuracy the riots, being London-based myself. I was surrounded by the riots as they were happening quite literally. I'm equidistant here between Peckham and Deptford, so we were riot central here. And I noticed that the mainstream media wasn't covering the riots. I was listening to the local radio stations and not so much paying attention to the news reports, but to the callers. One thing that I noticed was that probably at least 1 in 4 callers were calling for military to be brought onto the streets of London, and this was within hours of the start of the first riot. And that this sort of 1 in 4 callers carried on throughout the first 2 days of the rioting until eventually it went up to more like 2 in 3, and you could hear that the tone of the calls had changed from what appeared to be repeating some kind of a script to genuine fearful calls for the military to be called out. So it would appear that there was an orchestrated media hack of calls for military rule to be used to rein in the riots, and then that once that meme had been repeated enough into the media, that then the mind of the people pick up on it and begin to repeat it out loud themselves.
Well, indeed, and of course we probably will have the military on the streets come next summer.
Funnily enough, I actually hope so.
Right, go on.
No, I really hope so. Your average soldier is, again, we're talking about this edifice, and in order to construct a British soldier that will work within and without the propaganda model, they have to be convinced within a certain degree of the truth of the lie that they have been told.
Well, of course, that is if, of course, you can get that message through. Although, of course, one of the problems we've got with the Olympics...
Well, no, this is what I'm suggesting.
A lot of the soldiers may not actually be British,
well,
and that's the problem.
This is one thing that certainly we saw with the London riots, was the importing of police from outside police forces, and even up until, I think it was about 3 weeks after the riots, we still had paddy wagons rolling around the local area with headloo on them full of Welsh policemen.
Right, yeah.
And again, this is specifically because local London policemen are likely to be on the riot lines with their neighbours and relatives on the other side of the barricade. Yeah, whereas if you bring in a force from outside, then there isn't the peer connection, the local connection, and so you can ask of them more brutal tactics. And this is what I was actually saying about the army training, about them having to believe the lie so wholeheartedly, is that because they have to believe the lie so wholeheartedly, it's much harder then to get them to brutalise the British public, because that's who they're there to believe that they're there to defend.
I mean, it was interesting. I don't know if you saw last night, there was a TV programme, that series Coppers, and they were following some of the policemen around during the riots, and it was just interesting to hear, what the policemen had to say about it, and they certainly, were very much of the opinion that there was nothing much to be very impressed by, and that basically there was a complete breakdown of law and order. And I just thought it was interesting the way that was sort of portrayed on the show. And obviously next year we are going to have the Diamond Jubilee and the Olympics, and the security of the city. Obviously you've got to have some, but I think it is looking at the moment like it's going to be so tight. You really have to sort of wonder how that is going to work out, especially when you've got, as I understand it, several thousand American troops and surface-to-air missiles, American ones, being placed around the Olympic Stadium. So, yeah, I think next
one does have to slightly wonder about those sort of reports.
Well, one does, and yet, of course, if this is what's been put into the mainstream, which it is, even if it's not true, the fact that they're saying it, you have to wonder why they want you to believe it, So, I think we're heading into a very, very strange and interesting time this summer.
I certainly think so. Certainly if the beginning of the year has been anything to go by, it's certainly going to be an auspicious year.
Well, yes, indeed, yes. And, of course, that's where you get into the whole realms of the 2012 Prophecies stuff. And again, now as somebody that's worked in this field for many years, and I edited, for instance, Jeff Stray's book, Beyond 2012, I'm very aware that the whole way people are discussing the 2012 prophecies has now taken this turn of sort of simplifying it to the point of morality. How many times in the last couple of weeks have you heard the media say, end of the world, it's the end of the world, and the end of the world hasn't come, and we're in 2012, and just the sheer stupidity of the tones they adopt. Because, of course, very few serious researchers of this have been saying it's the end of the world.
Absolutely.
If anything is to be gleaned from what prophecies there are and what ancient calendrical cycles there are, is that it's about a cycle, it's about shift, it's about consciousness shift, which of course we can all decide to have if we want to anyway. And yet the media's managed to stick it out there that we all said it was the end of the world, so that of course when that doesn't happen, which of course it won't, we can all be made to look very, very stupid. So again, I think there's a lot of conditioning being used now around the 2012 phenomenon. It's going to get very boring by the end of the year, for sure, with the way that we are treated, unfortunately.
Okay, Andy, look, we've already done an hour, believe it or not.
Wow.
So I'm going to give your voice a rest, and I need to refill my teacup here. So let's just stick on a tune, and I think we should crack on to the 2012 myth, to be quite honest. I think that's quite a sentient...
that seems like a good place to go.
Sort of a New Year sort of thing to do in 2012, isn't it?
Yeah, well, why not? If we don't do it this year, we never will.
Everybody else is doing it, let's jump on that bandwagon. Okay, well, this is a nice long tune, because I needed enough time to boil the kettle, so we've got a bit of Underworld and Pearl's Girl for everybody. This is 9 minutes 36, so you've got plenty of time to go and have a comfort break and get the kettle on and settle yourself in ready for the next hour, Andy.
Jolly good.
Excellent, right. And we're back on air with fresh, refreshed cups of tea. And we're eager to go. Right, we couldn't stop chatting even when we were off air there, even through 9 minutes of Pearl's Girl. That was Underworld, by the way, if anybody was wondering, from the fabulous album, The Second Toughest in the Infants. Always a favourite of mine. Right, Andy, so we were going into the realms of 2012. I suppose I better shut up and perhaps let somebody that has perhaps a little more information rather than just opinion to put out on the subject.
Well, what's amazing about the 2012 phenomenon is how rapidly it sort of has come to the fore, really just in the sort of last 6 or 7 years. I mean, I remember 15 years or so ago now, we have a little organisation called Changing Times down here in Sussex, and, we've been having meetings now for 20 years, in fact. And this chap called Jeff Stray started to come along, and he always had this bundle of stuff under his arm, and he was always talking about, have you heard about the Mayan prophecies? Have you heard about 2012? To which the answer was no, and, initially we thought the guy was obviously an eccentric, until we started to read it. And he would bring in something new every week, and we'd look at it, and we realised this guy was on something. Now, he was not the first, of course. You've got other people out there like John Major Jenkins, as one very prominent example, and Hosea Wells, now deceased. But
Ian Lungold as well, I find.
15 years ago, this was not on anybody's radar, and it was the sheer weight of evidence that there was a cycle recorded in history that seemed to, if you like, be considered significant. That's what's led to all the fuss now, which is mainstream enough that they can make fun of it, which I suppose, to look at it on the bright side, goes to show just how prevalent, talk about it has become. But it's not entirely without foundation for once, and that's what makes it interesting.
Mm. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I just mentioned there Ian Lungold. Have you come across his work?
I know the guy's name. I don't know him personally.
Okay, well, no, he's another one that died a couple of years ago, but certainly I think some of his work is, on the Mayan calendar, is some of the more rational and reasonable discussion about it that I've seen to date, and certainly his feeling about it isn't that it's marking any sort of an end date at all.
Well, I think what is certainly the case, and I think you have to look beyond the Mayan take on it, is that you've got a number of cultures around the world. The Maori, for instance, in New Zealand, on the opposite side of the world. You've got the Chinese, who seem to have encoded the same cycle of 5,125 years into the I Ching. Mm. You've got all the different sort of tribes of the Americas, South and North, and even Zulu tribes seem to have something to say about this. So there seems to be a cycle that's embedded itself somewhere in the psyche of mankind. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, that it's a cycle of, endings and beginnings in the apocalyptic sense.
Yes.
In terms of the shift of consciousness sense, there may well be something to it. But that's not to say that, of course, it won't be associated with disasters. I mean, some people believe that this is very much connected with a wider cosmic cycle, whether it be cosmic dust coming in or what Dr. Paul Violette calls galactic superwaves, which is this notion that, on a cyclical basis, our galaxy is pulsing out these electromagnetic waves, and as they pass through at regular intervals, they will, of course, affect the behaviour of stars. Mm-hmm. So, in his view, if you look at cosmic dust levels, and there are bands of this in ice core samples, and this guy's an astrophysicist, so he's worked with this over the years, he believes there certainly is a cycle that, if nothing else, could affect the sun. Mm. And, of course, the sun, as we speak, has been becoming much more active than we've known in quite a long while. And, as we know, the sun has cycles. It has an 11-year cycle, of course, but it has wider cycles within the cycles. And many people are of the opinion that it is getting to the point where it could do something extraordinary. And I think we should bear in mind that we're not here just talking about fringe scientists, or, NASA themselves. Just in the last 2 or 3 years have been putting out very sort of loud announcements that they are concerned about the effects that a huge solar flare could have on our electricity grids, for instance. Now, that is genuinely a concern.
Well, we actually had an example of that, didn't we, with the Canadian grid overheating and shutting down half of Canada and most of New York State, wasn't it?
Indeed, just a few years back. So, of course, the concern is that that could happen on a global basis if you had a particularly big flare in the wrong place. And I mean, we have a precedent for that. Back in 1859, we had what, of course, is famously now called the Carrington event. And that was a recorded solar flare which, had it occurred today, when so much now is based on electricity, would have basically shut down our civilization as we know it. And yet that is not, as far as we know, considered one of the biggest solar flares that the sun can produce. So I find it interesting that NASA is saying that the peak of the current cycle is going to be, in fact, May 2013. For a while they were saying it was going to be 2012. But some people think there is a wider cycle and that this is what the ancients were recording. They knew there was climate change when this came around. They also knew that people responded differently, and maybe that did have an effect on civilizations. And obviously, if we today lost all our electricity, that wouldn't have been a problem for them back in the old days, but it is now. Well, you certainly then would see a big effect. The other side of all this, however, is that if it were the case that we were to receive stuff from the sun, electromagnetic, radiation, whatever it may be, there are people like Rick Strassman and Dr. Michael Persinger that have been running experiments for years, seeing how the human brain responds to increased electromagnetic waves. And they have predicted all sorts of effects that we could sort of find ourselves having a mass out-of-body experience in certain circumstances. Now, that, of course, is a very subjective thing, but nonetheless, altered states of consciousness are known to result as a result of exposure to electromagnetism. So if the sun suddenly did spike something out that we weren't expecting, well, I don't know, maybe it will turn out that the prophecies were right, in as much as there could be something we've not experienced before or not for a very long time. And it could, of course, have a very profound effect on the world. So therefore, I don't think anybody really thinks it's the end of the world. That's a ridiculous kind of simplification, but maybe the end of a cycle and the beginning of something new. And I think the problem that we've got is because people have put too much on the precise date of 21st of December 2012. Now, that's the problem. Now, everything has to have a centre.
Well, Terence McKenna is...
He's going to have a centre somewhere. That doesn't mean that everything happens on that day. And part of the problem we've got is people have been going around expecting everything will happen on that day. My advice to people would be make sure you have some food and water in for the day after, because the odds are it will not see anything extraordinary. But people are forgetting that what prophecies there are and all the different cultures, it's about a time of change at its beginning. It's a new era. It nowhere is stated that it then happens on one day. So we could be looking at something that could take many years to pass through. And I'm particularly interested in astrology. My partner, Helen Sewell, is a professional astrologer who's written a lot about this, that even if you put all the prophecies in the bin, actually, it looks like we're heading into interesting times anyway. And in my personal view, astrology is something that has not been accorded the respect that it deserves. Again, it's debunked. Brian Cox says it's rubbish. Richard Dawkins says it's rubbish. So it must be. Well, but actually, when you look at the statistics, you realise there's something going on there. And that alone says, particularly in England, curiously enough, we're going to see some big changes. We're already in the beginning of that now. So either way, we are going to, I think, be seeing a new shift of consciousness, which, of course, is not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, I think certainly that as far as astrology goes, there is some part of an explanation for the mechanics of astrology in the quantum theory, in quantum entanglement, because if any photon is emitted from an atom, if that photon is acted on at any point in its journey by quantum entanglement, that enactment is transmitted directly back to the atom that it was emitted from.
Well, indeed, yes.
And
obviously that opens the doors to many interesting things which would connect in with things like astrology.
Well, and if you then add to that the fact that because we are warm objects in cold space, as human organisms walking around, from the moment of our birth, we're, in fact, from before the moment of our birth, we're actually emitting infrared light from our body. Any heat-sensing camera will pick us up as a bright object.
Well, and there's another factor as well. I mean, there's an astronomer, not an astrologer, but an astronomer called Dr. Percy Seymour. Now, he's proposed that what's going on with at least the basics of astrology, it can't explain everything, but some of it, is that basically the planets are moving around in the solar wind. Of course, that's going to have a profound effect, and he basically says that it imprints on our DNA. So there are certain positions at certain times that are going to affect the people born at that time. So you're going to see recurring cycles in characteristics and personalities, which makes some kind of sense.
Well, there certainly would be
much more to it than that, of course. But I think there are systems, there are mechanics that when you start to look at them, you realise just to dismiss astrology is a very simple, over-simple way of looking at things.
Well, certainly as far as the gravitational interaction between the celestial bodies, I mean, the interaction between the Sun and Jupiter is enough to anchor the enormous Jupiter in its orbit around the Sun, and we routinely pass between the connection, the gravitational connection between Jupiter and the Sun.
Yes.
And so regardless of how small you may be able to measure that here on Earth with a gravitational measurement, certainly its impact on something as sensitive as the construction of our DNA at the time of our conception is entirely possible.
Well, I mean, you also have a nearer example of people who respond to the full moon. Now, again, you know, scientists and astronomers, they always come up with a very sort of pat answer, well, it's just because it's brighter, and so we've evolved, you know, knowing we can do different things when the sky is brighter, when the moon's full. And that is complete rubbish, because you look at the amount of species that even if they can't see the moon, they respond, we biologically respond. There's something in the cycles of the moon that certainly you can feel, and once you start to tune into it, I mean, you can feel it's a full moon, even if you can't look out the window.
Absolutely.
And if you look at police records and you look at hospitals and indeed you talk to priests, they will tell you those are guaranteed every time you'll get an increase in sort of people behaving out of the ordinary because there is clearly something which is activating different parts of our mind. And again, I get very bored with hearing the sort of the debunking versions of what the full moon means.
Well,
so
we're 90%.
We have clear.
We're 90% water, or sort of 80-odd% water, and the moon lifts the tides in the oceans by 12 feet. So it would be foolish to suggest that there's no effect on our physical
indeed
functioning.
But that again is, you know, unfortunately part of the programming that we're bombarded with. But so coming back to what we were saying about 2012, so, you know, there's another aspect. I think that there are movements in the heavens, there are solar cycles, there are cosmic cycles that could well have an effect. But to simplistically say that it's all going to happen on one day, and if it doesn't, it was rubbish, I think is a very foolish way to approach it. And the other thing I would argue, and I think a lot of people who've been researching the 2012 phenomenon for a long time would agree with this, is that actually there is a shift of consciousness taking place because people have focused in on the idea that 2012 might make a difference. So it's become self-fulfilling. People have started to prepare themselves. They've started to look at their lives and their relationships and what goes on to think, well, if something big did happen, am I ready? Is this who I want to be when I go through that? So, of course, that's actually triggered a raising of consciousness in its own right, which I think's good enough, even if nothing else happens. So we're still, therefore, living in exciting times, regardless, in my view.
Well, certainly for me, the prospect of sort of troubled times has certainly made me re-examine my approach to, I suppose, the sort of survivalist mentality, and to re-sharpen some of the skills that I'd acquired in some of my sort of past, previous life experiences, even though I'm now stuck here in the city, beginning to re-equip myself with the tools that would allow me to survive in something other than a city environment, just and also as a matter of if shit does come on top, then every person who isn't reliant on somebody else for something else is somebody that is allowing that resource to be available for somebody else.
Well, I mean, you mentioned earlier on living, in London with the riots going on, and I mean, that demonstrated, if nothing else, that even if you put aside the more cosmic stuff and solar flares wiping out the electricity grid or any of that, actually there
Social
are
unrest.
all manner of things that could bring civilization to a halt, at least temporarily, where we are going to have to maybe be able to look after ourselves for a while. I mean, just one example of that, just last year we had snow in Sussex. Now, that actually doesn't happen very often, but the upshot is, of course, when it does snow, everything grinds to a halt. And the panic that set in the village where we live so quickly led to the shop shelves basically being empty within a few hours. And, of course, lorries couldn't come in, so there were no resupplies. And the kind of sense of apocalyptic, oh, my God, what are we going to do? It took no time for that to set in. By the next day, there was a Land Rover from the local farm. You drive around the village selling food off of the back. And you think, my God, if you imagine you had a few weeks of this, where would we be? And that's where you begin to realise that we have probably, well, almost certainly become far too reliant on just the expectation of a food supply chain that is always going to be there. Anything, whether it be a fuel crisis or rioting or some kind of civil unrest, or even the collapse of the euro, anything could put a stop to that any day. Well, being prepared to sit something out, I think, would be very, very sensible in any case.
Well, I remember the panic buying of the 70s that was largely driven by market manipulations and media kind of propaganda and diversions, but I distinctly remember being taken around the shops as a 6 and 7 year old, and my mother being concerned that we wouldn't be able to get this, that or the other because panic buying had started on that particular commodity. One week it would be sugar, the next week it would be bread, and the shelves would literally be emptied of that product, and there had never actually been a shortage. There had just been the rumour of a shortage.
Yes, well, that's all you need, isn't it? Well, they always say, don't they, whoever first coined it, we're only 2 meals away from revolution, You block 2 meals and people begin to panic, and you see it happen very quickly. So, for whatever reason you go about it, I think people learning to try to be a little bit more self-sufficient without going into that kind of local militia, let's kill everybody else mentality. That's no help. People need to perhaps start to just be ready to think, okay, how would I look after myself?
Well, the other thing as
this
well,
infrastructure around me suddenly stopped.
Well, we were talking about TNS's motto of seeking solutions while we were off air there, and that's something that I actually was mentioning on air just recently on our show about the situation here with the riots and my neighbours. I live in a predominantly black area, and certainly a lot of my neighbours were involved in the rioting. Certainly a lot of my friends were even, certainly in the looting that went on afterwards. But it felt entirely safe here because we have built community. We know each other, we speak to each other, we say hello to each other, we help each other when we're in trouble. And that this can only be fostered by, you have to breach those boundaries. I mean, I can assure you that moving into a predominantly black area as a white family with, as an all-white family with teenage boys, we could have expected an awful lot of difficulty in being accepted into this neighbourhood. But again, as a result of just complete openness, complete refusal to accept social constructs and social cues that make you keep your front door bolted and fear everybody that's not of your own skin colour and your own social kind of peer group, that we can begin to rebuild our communities and we can begin to foster a sense of security, at least in and of ourselves, from ourselves. that fearing our neighbours is the very easiest of things to be manipulated.
Well, as of course, this is what many people think, as you know, it has exactly been what's happened. We've been very easily turned against each other to the point where we fear each other, we police each other, we police ourselves without anybody else even having to impose rules on us because we are afraid. And if you read, as I'm sure you probably have at some point, George Orwell's book, 1984, that's kind of how that nightmare world was achieved, by actually getting people to police themselves and each other through fear. And then, of course, it makes it very easy. So we have to be ever so careful that we don't fall into that. And, I mean, this is the danger, isn't it? Because, you know, we're here talking about the possibility of civil unrest and all of this. The problem that comes about from that is, how do you respond? Because there are certainly some people who are saying, well, we've got to get out there on the streets, we've got to protest, and people should be out there setting fire to things and all the rest of it. But, of course, if you do that, and you're not focused, and you don't know what the ultimate aim of doing that is, it just plays into the hands of those who would control us. It would give them every justification for yet more draconian powers, and many people believe that was one of the very things that went on with the riots last year, as we've already said, which maybe was why they did stand back for one night and let it happen. So, you know, this is the problem. How do we respond? Because we need to be ready, and you're absolutely right. Community, real community, I think is going to be the way forward. Because, I mean, that really struck me in the snow. I thought, okay, if that was it, and never again was a lorry load full of food going to come our way, there would probably be a certain amount of people just trying to grab what they could and steal off somebody else and that. But in the end, the only way you could survive would be to actually learn to act as a unit, a community unit, and stop fighting each other and try to, you know, pool resources. And that ultimately is going to be the solution.
Well, the selfish gene theory has been largely discredited now, and it would appear that the natural state for human society to be based in is mutual cooperation.
Exactly right. I mean, it seems clear that's the only way we've managed to survive this far.
I mean, this is another thing that actually came up again in my show from last week, and has been a repeated topic of discussion since then, has been the nature of mutual indebtedness to act as a glue that actually binds society together, that certainly our local society here is bound together by mutual trust, lending and borrowing, without necessarily accounting for every penny.
Sure. Well, I mean, that again is very important, because as soon as something just becomes about having and not having, that creates a very sort of black and white polarity, which is just going to, of course, end in conflict. And yeah, the sense of sort of a unified cause of sharing creates a completely different consciousness, and certainly collective consciousness, and this is something maybe we could go on to talk about later tonight, is, I think, something that has not been explored enough, because I think as well as the social outcome and effects of collective behaviour, I think there is, for want of a better word, a kind of a collective field, a psychic effect as well. And I think the experiments which prove that are very strong.
Rupert Sheldrake.
I actually explore that in the last part of the book, The Truth Agenda, looking at the science of collective consciousness, because that offers an enormous amount of hope. That actually, if enough people change the way they are, the way they think and behave, not only does that socially affect the people around you, but it actually has a wider ripple effect through the collective consciousness. And through that offers a tool to change the world, to use a corny phrase, just by changing yourself and your own behaviour. And these are things that I think need much more exploration.
Okay, well, rolling back onto the topic of the hour of the sort of 2012 prophecies, one of Ian Lungold's descriptions of this Bacton, the final Bacton of the Mayan calendar, is that it's described as the Bacton of conscious co-creation. Have you come across that through any of the other authors?
Well, I mean, yes, and in as much as it should be remembered that the end, or shall we say, that's a bad word, but the turning point of the calendrical cycle, in the Mayan terminology, they called it Creation Day. They didn't call it Destruction Day. It was called Creation Day.
Well, I mean,
this is a very important connotation is very different to all the end of the world stuff.
Just to make a point on, I mean, it's very easy sometimes for words to flow over us without us necessarily considering their deeper meaning. But just to explain, we have always been in a situation of co-creating. That as consciousnesses in the universe, we literally create the reality that we coexist in. But the difference between all of historical time and this, I think it was sometime spring last year we entered this Bacton, wasn't it? Sort of March time last year, I believe. March the 9th seems to spring to mind.
There's various sort of versions of it, and some people say we've already gone into it years ago, others say we haven't yet. But I think it's near enough just to say we're pretty much there, whatever month you agree on.
Well, essentially that we entered the realm of conscious co-creation, where we now have become self-aware of our role as creators of the universe, and now we can consciously co-create the universe that we inhabit. So if there's something that displeases us, that by joining together and discussing not only what it is that displeases us, but how we would want it to be better, that we quite literally create that sort of, using Tom Campbell's analogy, that delta T that collapses the probability field over that desired outcome.
Well, I think that's completely right. And I mean, when you look at the experiments now where they've seen how even computers will react to ripples going through mass consciousness without any physical connection, clearly, when we all think in a certain direction, we are actually changing the energetic environment around us. There's no other conclusion that you can come to. Although, of course, the mainstream scientists simply debunk it and they say they've got their results wrong. And when you look at work of people like Dean Radin, who has collected together what he calls meta-analysis, all the different experiments done into this kind of stuff over the years, even if you factor in a huge amount of chance, it's millions to one against the odds that this is just chance. We clearly shape the world around us by what we think. And when we act together, and curiously, when we focus seemingly very positively on something, this is when you seem to get the biggest reaction. Now, it's not always the way. Fear can also be a big one. If you look at the response of the Global Consciousness Project, as they call it, which is still running around the world today, if you look at the response of the different computers that they've got, or eggs as they call them, basically across the world, 9/11 was a big one. Obviously, there was a huge focus of consciousness on what was going on there. Now, that was not a good one. Also, the tsunami of, not the most recent one, but I think 2004 on the Boxing Day, which, of course, killed many, many people. That, again, was a huge ripple through the collective consciousness field. And what is interesting here is that these computers are all running completely independently of each other. They're not linked together. They've got their own power supplies, and they're both, all of the different ones, there are many of them now around the world, are picking up exactly the same spikes, if you wish.
Is this part of the WebBot program?
Not quite, but that's not unrelated.
Okay.
The WebBot is kind of another way of monitoring collective consciousness. It's basically seeing what's coming up, what people are looking at on the internet, what they're thinking, and managing to make predictions through what they're seeing people talk about. But of course, that's a different way, but still a valid way of tuning into the collective. But no, the Global Consciousness Project is very much actually about recording whatever this ripple through the field, as, say, somebody like Lynn McTaggart would call it, whatever this is, when we think we are creating a domino effect, and it can be recorded, and we are all very clearly responding in similar ways to certain things. And when we do this in a very large way, and many people focus on the same thing at the same time, that's when you get the biggest results. And what that seems to suggest is, therefore, if we learn to tap that, and we actually learn to use that faculty positively, which is what I think you're kind of suggesting here, who knows where that could take us? We already know, through some experiments, although it's one of the, if you like, the least provable things, is telekinesis. Now, there have clearly been experiments where people have moved objects with their minds and all the rest of it, it happens far less frequently than, say, just direct mind-to-mind communication, which is much more common, but it happens. And some have even said, okay, imagine, if they announced tomorrow that a killer asteroid was heading our way, what are you going to do? You're going to wait for Bruce Willis to go up there with a nuclear missile and blow it out of the sky? Or, if it is possible to move objects, if enough people collectively were to try to tap in to this collective consciousness field, maybe it might even be possible to move it out of harm's way. Okay. Which sounds on one level insane, and yet that's the kind of conclusion that ultimately you have to come to if our minds are actually acting in such a way that they are affecting the physical world around us, which I realise opens the whole door to the whole Jedi Knight kind of fantasy. Well, I don't think we're there yet. I've been studying a few thousand years of evolution. Who knows?
Yeah,
certainly can't be ruled out. Looking at the experiments that are going on today, so I think there's a lot of scope for exploration here. Certainly.
Well, again, with referring back to Tom Campbell, he's an American physicist who's working in the fields of physics and metaphysics. He's actually a jobbing statistician.
Is this the My Big Toe guy?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, he would suggest that, yes, it would be possible to change the course of that asteroid, but within the rule set. So we have to have continuity. Yeah, okay. We can't just jump from having an asteroid heading towards Earth and then suddenly not heading towards Earth. Yeah.
So I suppose, therefore, the task becomes knowing how to
Imagineer
program that rule set in the first place.
Or at least how to Imagineer something that is allowed within that rule set to happen to interfere with the perceived future.
Right, yes, for sure. But, I mean, what I think is great is that people are thinking about this. I mean, I remember in the run-up to the Millennium, Uri Geller, and of course, as some claim Geller's a complete fraud, he's just a trickster and all that. I'm inclined to think from what I know, and having met him at least once, that there is something a bit more going on.
Okay.
Although it's possibly adds in the showmanship as well. But he, whatever you think of that side to him, he had a very good idea. And what he wanted to do on the day of the Millennium was get, stadiums full of people around the world to all, at the same time, focus their minds on the task of disarming the world's nuclear arsenal.
Yes, I remember.
In the same way that he gets people to shout at watches when they're watching the telly and get clocks to start or to stop or whatever it may be. And although maybe that sounds like crazed fantasy, I thought that's a really good sort of way of thinking. That step towards, yes, if we all focused our minds, maybe things like this could be possible. In the event he didn't do it. And, who knows, maybe he just...
Well, funny you should mention the millennial sort of celebrations, but I remember as a child being saturated with the date 2000 AD, you know what I mean? We even had the comic 2000 AD come out in my childhood sort of thing. But it was the date on the calendar that everybody was looking forward to. There were all these millennial doomsday prophecies as well surrounding that date. And I remember even as quite a young child realising that it was merely a date on the Gregorian calendar whose machinations to adjust our current calendar to the dogma of the Vatican of the day meant that there was so very little to do with anything auspicious to do with the date 2000. It was all to do with the date 2,000 years previously and had no more significance than the date 1000. But, I still felt...
in the run-up to the year 1000, we had exactly the same kind of end-of-the-world mongering that we had in the run-up to the Millennium.
There is that famous quote of the monk, isn't there, that sounds... that when you actually read it, sounds like an absolute modern-day account of fear of rioting, breaking out of social collapse, and you read it, and then at the bottom it says, written by X, Y and Z in the year 999...
Indeed so. I mean, it's worth remembering, though, that in a way takes us back to what we were discussing earlier on, which is, of course, a lot of what fueled certainly the Millennium expectations, and also what's got mixed into the 2012 phenomenon now is the kind of the evangelical Christian end time movement. Because, of course, they are, not everyone, but there is a large contingent who are convinced that the second coming, the ultimate day of judgment and the rapture is going to happen within our lifetimes. And, of course, they're tying it in very much with the 2012 sort of general prophecies. And, of course, what is interesting about that is that we've been here so many times before. Now, it is said that the early Christians considered, even the apostles, now if we believe anything of what's written down in the New Testament, even the apostles expected the second coming of Christ to be within their lifetime. And of course it wasn't. And so therefore everybody kept moving the date. And then it was, okay, well if it wasn't then, it must be this date. It must be 500. No. It must be the year 1000. No. Well, then it must be 2000. Yeah. And then of course it's going to keep getting moved.
And all the
so
time
we're back in that mindset now. And because there is, for once, another sort of peg of the 2012 phenomenon to where you have actually got a lot of cross-referencing prophecies from around the world. Now, of course, that's what's being focused in on. And so it's all getting mixed together in this strange sort of, cauldron in the middle. And it means that it gets very hard to get to the truth of what's going on, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's worth just saying briefly, when we talk about the prophecies, obviously, a lot of people in the mainstream have latched onto the Mayan prophecies. Now, that's what we hear most about, the Mayan prophecies. In fact, there are not that many Mayan prophecies.
There's a few stone tablets that have been interpreted by Western Europeans.
Well, not even a few. As far as I'm aware, there is only one stone tablet, which is in Chochiguero in Mexico, which actually directly refers to what will happen at the end of this current sun or time cycle. And very annoyingly, it begins to describe that we will see the return of the 9 support gods. But very irritatingly, when you get to the end of the tablet, somebody's managed to smash off that part of it, so you can't actually read what it is they're then going to do when they arrive.
Cortez probably shipped it back to the Vatican Library.
Well, this is the kind of accusation, of course, that gets made. But then, of course...
especially by the likes of me.
Well, indeed so. But then, of course, that's where people have to leap to the only other prophecies that we have that are the ones that get quoted the most, which was very much based on what a bunch of people called the Jaguar priests, or the Chilam Balam, as they were known. Now, they were basically Mayan elders that they held on to a lot of knowledge that had only been passed down by word of mouth for years. Now, by the time they came to actually write some of these down in basically European language, the high Mayan culture had already been and gone. And many of the prophecies that we now hear referred to were actually not written down until about 1500, but they were based on word-of-mouth folklore. And we should remember, of course, that the Maya calendar in itself was based on an earlier calendrical system that the Olmec people created. So, it does have a longevity. It goes back a very long way. So what often gets quoted is the writings of the Jaguar priests. And it is interesting. They do describe at the end of this current cycle that I think there's a marvellous line about no one will believe in their governments, which, of course, you could argue is pretty much where we are now. And there is a line saying, and the end of the world shall come. Now, this is, of course, what people are putting a lot on that. But the way you interpret that phrase, the end of the world shall come, of course, that could mean many things. A world can mean lots of different things.
I was going to say it would have to depend
on how you interpret it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And maybe it's just a symbolic shift. Yeah, it might be the end of a world, but not the end of the world. But that's where really that whole thrust comes from. And I think we need to see it in a much more nebulous way than that, of course.
I certainly think that we're possibly in a shifting pattern at the moment. I feel that when the direct forces that generally act upon mankind, pushing it in a particular direction, loosen their holds a little, we enter this phase where the future becomes very much more indeterminate, and that again may dial into this conscious co-creation, that in this kind of future soup that we're presented with that appears so confusing at the moment, it's down to us that can perhaps step back a little from the model and see a future beyond the soup that will lead humanity, through these troubled times and out the other side, which I entirely hold that we will do.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Again, we always seem to want things to be very black and white. We're all looking for the easy stop point and, and then everything will be put right. I mean, that's certainly one of the problems with the end time movement among the evangelicals, is that I'm not disrespecting their beliefs, but the problem is that this mindset creeps in that says, so we don't need to do anything, because Christ will come and all will be well and he'll sort out the good people from the bad and we don't need to do anything here and now, which worries me because, and this is not, lest anybody think that I'm criticising religious people, this is not a problem that's confined to that area. I mean, in the New Age realms, we have a lot of people that believe in the ascension process, the Ashtar command, the ascended masters, this notion that there is a race of beings out there from the stars who are sort of up there in orbit waiting to help us when the earth changes begin. Now, I can't say these don't need to exist any more than I can say Christ won't be coming back. But what I do think is that if any of these kinds of forces are out there, I would imagine they wouldn't be too impressed if they thought that all we've done in the run-up to whatever's going to happen is just sit back and do nothing. Yeah. I don't believe that if Christ came back today, he would just say, well done for doing nothing at all. I just can't see that. I think
isn't it a Christian...
our hands are the tools, you know what I mean? And I think we would be expected to have put in a bit of effort ourselves as well. So, I think this problem of just sitting back and thinking, well, we don't need to think beyond this end time, it is a block. It's a shame, because we, in fact, should now, as you rightly say, should be planning for many, many years ahead and trying to get a sense of where this is going to lead. And we're already in the big time of change. There's always change going on, of course, but I think there certainly is a feeling of an acceleration. It needs to happen. There's lots of things in the world that don't make sense, that don't add up, that we need new systems, whether it be about money or just the whole way the social structure works. We need to rethink it. And this is a very good opportunity to do so, because so much is now coming up for re-evaluation, and we are going to have to deal with the world at the other end of it. So for those that are waiting, just to be beamed up to the fifth dimension without having to offer anything themselves, what worries me there is if, as it turns out, by any chance they're not beamed up into the fifth dimension, well, where's it going to go from there? And you could have a lot of disappointed people, and I already sensed that with the 2012 phenomenon, is that for those that have pegged so much on it, when they do get past 21st of December 2012, you could be dealing with a lot of very disillusioned people who may well, have to deal with a lot of depression and that, because they've used this, if you like, as a reason not to deal with their own stuff. And we have to deal with our own stuff, even if you believe in the prophecies. Surely, therefore, this is a time to look at our lives and sort ourselves out. And I think anybody that's doing nothing is possibly barking up the wrong tree, with the greatest of respect.
Be the change that you want to see appears to be the mantra amongst most of the sort of enlightened minds.
Yeah, well, exactly right. And I mean, the problem is that becomes a cliche, but it's true. In way of all cliches, there's a truth to that. And I think that is very much what this is about. So for those people sitting around scoffing, saying, oh, the whole 2012 phenomenon is a load of rubbish, there won't be any change. Well, okay, if you do think it's a load of rubbish, that's fine, but you should instead say, well, but actually I can see there is a need for change, so why don't we try to actually make it and streamline things in a positive direction that could actually stand a chance of making this a better world to live in?
Well, if people are perhaps feeling, because this is another issue as well, is that this can all seem so monumental and so overwhelming that people simply don't know how to act. And I would suggest that the modern society has built within it so many layers of addiction, from the mainstream media through to our where we get our groceries from, through to the addictions that most people will recognise, the drug and drink addictions that we may have, even the addictions to prescription medicines that we may need for certain ailments. or may feel that we need for certain ailments. And I think that that's something that everybody can work on, bar none. We all have addictions. I can speak with great experience on this subject, having been, I'm now a recovering alcoholic, heroin addict, speed. So I can speak at least with some authority on this, and I would suggest that if I was to enter any sort of era of social unrest, carrying any of the addictions that I have already shrugged, even just simply being a meat eater is an addiction that most people just have no idea that it is an addiction. It's not a need. You don't need to eat meat.
No, well, in fact, I've been vegetarian for about 30 years now, so indeed, yes, I think there's truth to that. I mean, I think you're touching on something really important here, which is that I think people often think, well, I can't change the world, I'm too small, nothing I do is going to make any difference. But at the end of the day, if you just decide, okay, I'm going to work on the world that I have around me, i.e. my friends, my family, my own life, you know, that's where change is going to have the knock-on domino effect. You don't have to take on board the weight of the world on your shoulders. If you can't deal with that, don't try to deal with it, but look at what's going on. Because everything in our lives is basically a microcosm of what's going on around us. And I mean, one thing I'm very sort of keen to make people aware of, certainly amongst the conspiracy world, is that, you know, we tend to do a lot of finger pointing. You know, it's the ruling elite, it's the Illuminati, it's the reptiles, whatever it may be, which may or may not be true.
Not us.
But we're always pointing the finger, yeah, but not saying, hang on a minute though, that if any of that's true, it only goes on because we allow it. Because we've created, if you like, a psychic collective structure that has propelled or allowed those people, beings, whatever they are, to be at the top. And if you actually started to sort of change the collective sort of undercurrent of it all by changing yourself, it may well be that they could no longer be supported. So we tend to project our fears that actually these are things we need to be dealing with in our own lives. We project that out and sort of blame others. We point the finger. And it may well be there are things out there to point the finger at, but as you've already identified, if you're not offering solutions at the same time, and you're not applying those same solutions in your own life, why would we expect the world around us to change? So I think very much the lesson of these times is to basically, as you say, be the change you want to be, but really be it. Don't just say it as a new age platitude, you know, really mean that. Look at, say, okay, is there anything in my life that actually is equally guilty? There's all these things that I don't like, I see it going on around me in the world and I don't like it. Am I also perpetrating that? And the funny thing is often you find you are, but you just don't realise it because you sort of distract from your own issues by constantly seeing it in the world around you. So I think we have to sort of get into this duality of, okay, acknowledging there are big things in the world that do need dealing with, but it starts here, you know, in how you relate to the people around you and owning your stuff, you know, working with stuff inside you that may not be perfect. And accepting that and being okay with that, but trying to do what you can to build on it and make yourself basically a sort of better human being, because that's where the future's going to change. And all the time we just sit back and try to let other people put it right for us, and then we're always going to wonder why the wrong people float to the top, you know. Because there has to be a collective responsibility.
Well, if we put bullies in uniforms and ask them to protect us, then we can't really be surprised that we're surrounded by bullies in uniforms.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, absolutely.
I do my very best to corrupt the mind of the youth. I've got 4 boys ranging from one's was just 21, turned 21 yesterday. Happy birthday, Jake. I'm sure he isn't listening because he thinks that I'm completely mad.
Of course, yes.
But as a result of from him down to our 14-year-old twins, we have had a succession of very vulnerable, exposed minds pass through our front door, and I do my very best to corrupt every single one of them, at the very least with the honour system that we run in this house. There is almost no discipline issued from us, the parents, to the children. We simply run on an honour system where you're expected to measure your own moral standards against your own internal compass and decide for yourself whether or not it's something right that you want to do. And that is a complete mind blast for most of the teenagers that walk through this door, because none of them live in honour with their own parents.
Well, and I think that, again, that's touching on something very important, which is that, we've always sort of looked to the outside for that to come and put stuff right. And people are frightened of responsibility. I think they're afraid to take that responsibility for themselves.
Well, although I come from the sort of Freeman movement, I very much hold that we are not going to change the mainstream society with our demands for the arrests of judges and the tearing down of society, because simply most people just do not have the wherewithal to live consistently within an honourable system. They want the get-out clauses, they want the easy buck.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true at the moment, and I think that's why we have to think a little bit long-term.
I suppose what I'm suggesting is that we possibly need a parallel system rather than to demand the removal of a system that offends us.
Yes.
Yeah, we should demand our ability to remove ourselves from that system and to remain within the law, which isn't the state of affairs at the moment.
Well, I mean, history records that, if you have a revolution and you use tyranny to try to get rid of tyranny, you wind up with more tyranny. You know what I mean? It's not a solution. I think you're absolutely right. You have to sort of build an alternative that already works and is already ticking along underground, if you like, until one day that becomes the overground.
An attractive alternative.
If you look back at the movements that have succeeded in history, those are the ones that wind up having longevity.
Absolutely. I mean,
that's what we need to do, is to actually offer another way, but not just offer it as a kind of a mind experiment, but actually get it up and running and do it. And as you say, you can't be unrealistic. You can't then expect that the whole rest of the world's going to fall into line around that. But in time, and maybe it's hundreds of years we're talking here, in time you may well find that if what you've offered works, it will speak for itself. And what doesn't work will equally be revealed as the patheticness that it is, and there will come a crossover. But you need time, and you can't just scream and shout and try to force change, especially when people are so programmed. You're not going to switch that programming off anytime soon. So, I think that's very sensible.
I believe that this promoting of an honour system is actually an incredibly potent tool in the deprogramming of the sort of programmed populace, in as much as soon as we are entrusted, as soon as we feel the emotion of trust that accompanies being trusted, we enter an entirely different mindset. We become honourable and know ourselves to be honourable. And the desire then to remain within honour and to conduct yourself with honour and to be able to be dignified, to no longer be treated as children of the world.
Yeah, well, I think what you're saying is really so important, and I would completely go with that. Self-respect, self-responsibility, but also realising that with that comes collective responsibility is going to be one of the big parts of the solutions that we need, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we've just hit another hour. My teacup is once more emptied. My bladder is full, so I'll be relieving myself and refilling myself simultaneously. We have a bit of Howling Wolf this time, just to prove the broad spectrum of music that the TNS listener can expect. We've slipped straight from Underworld from 92 to Howling Wolf, I think, 64. Anyway, this is a bit of Smokestack Lightning. We'll be back in 4.5 minutes. All right, Andy?
That's fine by me.
Excellent. See you in a sec.
Smokestack Lightning.
the fabulous one and only Howling Wolf with Smokestack Lightning there. We're back with Andy Thomas. That's right, I got it right. Sorry. Memory of an ant. Right, I was just asking Andy if it was okay, and it's something that I like to do with all of my guests if we've got time within the kind of the time frame that we've got, and having a full 3 hours, I think we can possibly go there. But it's something that's always intrigued me is about other people, is how you ended up being so goddamn open-minded.
Well, it's hard to say, really. I mean,
can you remember it was?
I've always had a kind of an interest in this kind of way of thinking, but I think, like a lot of people, you don't always know quite how you're supposed to live that. And I mean, for me, there's no question that it was when I came into contact, of all things, with the crop circle phenomenon that really opened me up. Now, one of the kind of weird things about the truth-seeking world is that some people are, they're quite happy to believe that every chemtrail, for instance, is out there to kill us or whatever it may be, but they can't believe that a single crop circle has ever not been made by people. And I still get criticism from some people who say, you don't still believe in that, do you? Mm. But what do you mean by believe? I mean, the fact is they're there. And what I've always been interested in is the absence of an answer. It's what they do to people. It's how they've stimulated people that matters. So for years, I mean, I started off just, working in the civil service, miserable job, all the rest of it. And then I spent quite a lot of years being a musician, playing keyboards, writing songs, so that was my world. And then one day there it was in the West Country, and there were crop circles. And all I can say is that I kind of immediately knew somewhere deep within that there was something that had changed. I can't explain. The questioning that I felt was, okay, how did that get there then? And I could not find a single person who could tell me. I could find theories and, different people's opinions, but all these people running around like madmen around the fields of Wiltshire, and I'd soon discovered far beyond, including back here in Sussex, nobody could tell me what was going on.
Mm. And you wanted a mechanism.
Because, I'm interested in mysteries, that immediately intrigued me, and I just wanted to know more. So that really was the beginning of the quest to find the truth about the circles, reading every book possible, talking to everybody and anybody. And that's when we wound up forming our own group here in Sussex, to monitor crop circles in the southeast of England. And we're still effectively running, except for now we talk about everything, of course. What I think it did for me was this, is that here I am, 20 years on, and I still can't tell you what makes crop circles. Clearly some are man-made, maybe many. All of them? Probably not. Not when you look at the totality of the evidence. And I know some people have an issue with that, and that's fine. That's entirely their right to feel that. But I believe the evidence speaks of something else going on.
I think the latest batch of colourised crop circles, just if anybody is still in doubt, I think it was last year, there were a couple where the lay of the crop actually worked like the iridescence of a butterfly's wings.
Which indeed, I mean, is one of the interesting things is you get textures within them, you get light and shade.
Well, that was the one that
catch some parts of the crop. Yeah, I mean, we're talking. I mean, not everybody knows. Right? Some people may be listening to this thinking we're just talking about little tiny circles in the crops. I mean, we're now talking about things hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet across. They're very, very complex. They're geometrically brilliant, and when you see them, whatever you think about them, they kind of touch the heart in an artistic way, never mind anything else, because they are so beautiful.
I'm very suspect of the pictograms, but certainly, and another one that's recently come out as well is if you rotate a graph, a diagram of a crop circle about an axis, quite often holographic shapes pop out from the rotated image. Which I would...
I mean, I think that is just kind of one of the qualities of geometrical shape, to be honest. I think you could probably do that with lots of different things. But what I think is important is the questioning that it led me and many other people down this path of saying, okay, I'm hearing the media debunk this every single year. The media say they're all man-made, it's all a joke, and every single year the media fail to deliver the evidence
with a plank of wood
that proves that. And so immediately you think, oh, hang on a minute, well, because I've studied this and I've worked in this kind of area, I know when something is being said which is not true. And of course, you soon then begin to realise that it's not just crop circles. So gradually, as I began by whatever strange means to, for instance, get asked to come and speak about crop circles, and then somebody in the end asked me, would I write a book? And there it was, before I knew it, I was writing and speaking about this whole world. What you realised was what these kinds of phenomena do is make people open up and see the world around them in a new light, that they need a trigger. Sometimes they know there are things going on that are not quite, if you like, normal, but they don't quite know where to start. But when you have something as absolutely staggeringly anomalous as a huge crop formation, obviously you can start to ask the questions. You've got a reason to. You can walk in it, you can touch it, you can lie down and roll in it if you want. This is unusual.
I think that's one of the reasons as well why the ethnogenic plants are so prohibited, the magic mushrooms and the psychotropic herbs that are native to this country, is simply that the experience of many a psychedelic voyage tears such big holes in what you believe to be reality in such at least a subjective way, that you may not have the objective proof to be able to take to somebody else and show to them that the world isn't how they thought it was. The experience itself is so diverse of the normal realms of reality that you have to begin to question, that which you are told.
Well, that's right. And I mean, what's interesting is what the shamanic people of older times knew, we've sort of now begun to rediscover through different means. And, it might be like somebody seeing either a crop circle or a ghost or a UFO, whatever it may be, just something that breaks into the envelope where they think, oh, maybe things aren't the way that I've been told. And to be honest, I think what you ultimately conclude isn't so important. It's the journey of going through that questioning that really matters. And I've seen some people come out the other side ripped apart, and they either wind up, basically, either you wind up with a very open mind and you're very balanced and you try to be open to all ideas, or some go the other way and they can't deal with it at all, so they debunk, they deny, and others even, they wind up in addictions. There's some people who turn to alcohol because they can't deal with the questions that it raises. Now, it might sound extreme, but it's true. And certainly people that have been with the crop circle mystery, for instance, for a very long time, often find it really drags them through the bush backwards. It's not necessarily comfortable, because also there's so much ridicule which gets aimed at you. But that's a very good training ground, because so I just thought, well, I don't care. I think there's evidence here worth exploring. And so I kind of got used to sort of speaking out in the face of a lot of opposition. And that obviously has sort of helped enormously when I've started to look at other stuff going on, beginning with other unexplained mysteries, and then over the years coming into the political stuff, the conspiracy stuff. I'm willing to hold my ground if I'm very sure about the sort of evidence, the statistics, whatever it may be. I'm more than happy for people to have their own mind on something. But if I hear people misquoting or, distorting the evidence, you very soon learn to latch onto that, and you learn to stand your ground in the face of that, even if it's just to insist that there is a middle ground explanation somewhere. But I certainly I get very annoyed when polarities come into being of, this is all true or none of it's true. 9 times out of 10, the truth is in the middle somewhere. And therefore you have to try to be very patient with all points of view, but at the end of the day, discuss the evidence. As Marcus Allen is fond of saying, it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of evidence. And that's true in everything, whether we're talking about unexplained mysteries or conspiracy theories. And it's the sensible, discerning accumulation and distribution of that evidence that's going to make the difference if you actually want to try to, give this any kind of gravitas in the world around you.
I think trying to base yourself as well in firm logic as well is always so many researchers will become bedazzled by the marvels of their researches without ever looking into things like Occam's razor and the trivium, logic, rhetoric and grammar, and with just the very simplest of kind of alterations to their mindset, they may immediately be able to see that some of the patterns that they're being shown are exactly that. They're simply pretty patterns that are being woven for them by some alter agency, some other agency.
Well, I think in all of these realms, when you're dealing with what the mainstream would call fringe, you have to learn to embrace mystery. You have to, I think, become comfortable with the notion that you might not fully get to the bottom of something, and that's all right. And I think what happens in the truth-seeking world very often is people, because understandably they're seeking absolutes, if they can't find them, they start to talk in absolutes in the hope that that will make something seem more convincing to the outside world. But of course, if you do that and the evidence isn't there to support it, you're soon shot down. If anything, it has a detrimental effect and you will be attacked for it. And I think there's a great power that comes with actually being able to say, no, it's not proven, but I believe there's some very good evidence that needs consideration. And then you find that often a lot of the opposition will drop off a bit because people can't really argue with that position. And if they don't have absolutely definitive proof to disprove what you are investigating, then really there's nowhere further their criticisms of what you believe in can go if you are saying, yeah, I accept that we're not sure what's going on here. And I think learning that and learning not to scream at people because they don't agree with you on something is very important. And of course, over the years, we've all, including myself, got into spats. But I've tried in recent times really not to go there because it doesn't get anywhere. Two people or two sides just shouting at each other, you wind up with the House of Commons. It's pathetic. It doesn't get us anywhere. There is a stronger, a deeper truth in the middle, which is to say, yeah, okay, probably both sides have got a point here, so let's see if we can find some, agreement here with the things that we can see do need attention, and that's often where you will find people they're happy to do that. But yeah, for sure, just shouting at somebody because they don't agree with you is no solution.
I was one of those shouty intellectuals. Absolutely, that was certainly one of my revelations to myself when I stopped drinking, as I realised just how strongly I had been a vigorous defender of the rationalist fundamental SI model of science for so many years, and then having researched it properly for myself, having realised that most of what I'd spouted was absolute bollocks and had absolutely no defence in logic or in fact at all, and I was just simply reiterating that which had been given to me as an absolute fundamental model, which was intrinsically flawed.
Well, listen, I think that it's perfectly reasonable to have a passion to support what you believe in, whatever it may be, but it's the danger is that you can too far go down the path of therefore beginning to only listen to that which supports your view. And at the moment I'm researching a new book about a whole world of conspiracy theory, kind of coming at it from a different angle, and quite a good way to explore something in such a way as to hopefully make a debate very clear to people that wouldn't necessarily go near this stuff, is to start with, okay, what's the consensus view on something? And if you want to know what the consensus view on a subject is usually a very good place to start is Wikipedia. You start with Wikipedia, okay, and you know that Wikipedia
like
is
every
not
other
reliable.
journalist.
It's written very often by very biased people, but what you're seeing there is what most people generally think. That's what they're fed. Yeah. So it's worth starting there, and then if there are little nuggets of doubt about certain stories, even expressed there, you think, aha, now we're getting somewhere. For them to even accept, for instance, that there might be a conspiracy view on something on Wikipedia, even if it's one line, it's still an opening. And then what I'll try and do is then find another source which is totally the conspiracy view. Read the rants, let's see what's being said there. And then, as a balance, try and find a middle ground. And obviously, now we have the gift of the internet. It's very easy to do this. And you soon begin to see where the middle ground truths lie. Now, that doesn't mean, and I'm not claiming here, that I have a massive insight that anybody else doesn't. But what I'm saying is anybody can do this. And you then begin to realize, okay, there are some areas of doubt. So I won't therefore be too black and white about how I sell this, because actually I can see nobody knows. Or sometimes the opposite. You can see that there is very definitely a consensus on certain areas which you can all agree on, which, plainly are whatever, conspiratorial, or whatever you want to call it. So it's that being able to see both sides without getting too upset at the people that disagree with you.
Not to become too invested in your own researches.
Well, yeah, for sure. And obviously some people, these people might attack you personally, and that's happened to me over the years.
I was actually going to ask, have you experienced the nutter on the bus sort of syndrome, where people will move away from you when you're invited to join them at a dinner table and things?
Well, funnily enough, it's not so much the nutter on the bus. I mean, if anything, in years past, or particularly in the crop circle and UFO realms, it's the people that have become very sceptical within those realms that cannot bear you still being in a position of not agreeing with them. They're often your most voracious critics, and especially if they see you sort of doing well in your field, whereas they've got very disillusioned and feel very bitter about it. That's actually where you often get the most criticism, and that's something you have to kind of learn to deal with. But again, that's where it should not be about personal feelings. It's about the evidence. It's got to be about balance of evidence, and because if that stands up, you can feel comfortable with that. And even if somebody is ranting and raving at you, if you're very sure that you've actually checked something out, that the likelihood is that they probably haven't, and very often people that rant and rave haven't, it gives you a kind of a solidity at the core. But it does mean being able to face reading things that are not comfortable, that may disagree with what you personally believe. But if you can come to an understanding of why people, believe what they believe, it's a very good grounding. And yeah, I mean, just occasionally, of course, you'll go and give a talk, and somebody will get up and say, this is disgraceful, I've never heard such rubbish in my life. Well, what can you do? You just have to let them have that. And I mean, very often, if you take 9/11 truth, and I gave a presentation not so long back where, I was mentioning the research into the thermitic dust in the buildings. Now, there is one view that this is evidence of, indeed, sort of thermite, explosive stuff, which is in there to make stuff burn brighter, burn hotter. There's another view in the conspiracy world that it's nothing to do with thermite whatsoever, and it's all to do with sort of like energy weaponry and stuff like this, which may possibly be true. But those people get very shouty if you dare say the opposite to what they think. So with what should have been like a presentation, like trying to present some kind of united front against the official story, of course winds up just collapsing in on itself. And we've seen that happen a lot in the kind of truth realms. And that's very dangerous. You have to allow people to disagree, of course, and you have to, of course, have different angles expressed. But when then one side suddenly starts screaming and shouting, how dare you say something which they don't agree with, of course that's where it just falls to chaos. And I think that's a real shame. And I think the truth world needs to learn to just accept that maybe there won't be agreement on some things, but they're not necessarily, therefore, the opposition. And I think that's the great danger, is that we tend to point the finger at somebody that doesn't agree and turn them into the enemy. And that's not always fair. It may just be that they don't agree with you on a certain point. And I think we need to be very, very cautious of that. So, in fact, if anything, that's where over the years I think it's been most difficult. If somebody says, you're mad, you believe in all that rubbish, I don't really care if they've not looked at the evidence. If they've looked at the evidence and said, well, I can't agree with you, well, okay, fair enough. That's all right, you can respect that. But
I prefer to actually ask them to please, then, if I'm wrong, then please correct me. Give me your data. Let me consider it, and then I will examine it against the data that I already have and consider my position in the light of that new data.
And I mean, the way of the world is such that very often people get into a rut of basically putting out there what they have got into the habit of putting out there. And I mean, I won't name them, but there are a certain number of TV skeptics that are always on the TV shows.
God, yeah.
And they're renter-skeptics. And they very often know nothing about what they've come in to be sceptical about. And I once did the Esther Ransom show some years back now, talking about crop circles. And they had Mr. Skeptic on saying, no, it's all a load of rubbish, and these people are quite charming, but obviously stupid for believing in this. And then in the green room, afterwards, just chatting away, very nice man, and he says, I don't know anything about circles, they just paid me to come here. And that really sums up the attitude, and I've come across that many times.
Rupert Sheldrake describes one of the routine sort of TV science skeptics that he comes up against being presented in a television show that I think it was actually one of the Conspiracy Files shows, as it happens, where he was shown broadly dismissing Rupert Sheldrake's work and his experimental results. And it wasn't until after the show that he found out that he'd actually made that footage before actually seeing any of the evidence, and when he was called on to repeat the experiment himself, he did so and actually got exactly the same results as Rupert, and still decried the experiment as being somehow false.
Well, this is where I think that is really less tolerable, because when people criticise you based on, clear examination of the evidence, that's fine, that is one thing. Where it is just them spouting forth basically rhetoric, because that's what they've got used to doing, that can't be respected, in my view. And unfortunately, an awful lot of that does go on. So, my suggestion to anybody in these realms would be, if you are going to try and put this stuff out there, and I think everybody should, be informed. Don't just read the first conspiracy website you find and go with everything that's on there. Look around, try and cross-reference, see, where the wider truth or possibilities lie, even if you can't get to the truth. And then be very accurate when you tell people that. And it's fine to tell people, there are some grey areas, but on the weight of evidence, whatever it may be, 9/11, for instance, the weight of evidence says clearly there were covert forces at work making this happen here, which were nothing to do with the ones we were told about. And people will respect that. I do find, on the whole, they can go with that, whereas if you start trying to make your case more solid than it really is, people pick up on that. You usually know when somebody's just getting into the realms of just going into their thing, and that's not so useful. So being informed and being okay with people disagreeing with you, I think is much more powerful than certainly shaking the fist. And I think we really need to avoid that.
Absolutely. I mean, that so fits with this station's premise about the coming events. We've got a last half hour. I know that we're broadcasting out of Ireland and largely a UK-based outfit. As I said earlier, we do go out to I think it's currently 134 countries, which I think is something to be shouted about. But I know that there's like a sort of a global fascination with these islands, and especially the history of these islands. Go on, what's your favourite British mystery?
Oh, well, I mean, you'd have to say crop circles in this conversation, I think, because although it is a global phenomenon, there's no question we have more in Britain than any other country. And, what that says about us as a nation, I don't know. But it is interesting that a lot of them do cluster in the areas where you often have ancient sacred sites. And obviously Wiltshire is full of them, Avebury being very much the epicentre. And everybody, of course, talks about Stonehenge, but and there have indeed been crop circles around there, but Avebury over the years has attracted more, and is arguably the more impressive monument. And what is interesting is that, people tend to look back at the stone circles and these ancient sacred sites as being evidence of, you'll often hear them say, a primitive culture. Well, I mean, if you look at a lot of the research that's gone into the stones of ancient Britain, particularly work by people like Robin Heath, that I would particularly recommend, you realise we were a very sophisticated society, you know, relative terms, but nonetheless, we knew our stuff mathematically. Whoever built those stones, they knew an awful lot. They understood number, they understood astronomy. These people were not stupid, and the term primitive, I think, is an outrage, really.
Absolutely.
But they clearly, although, you know, the people that put those down, they've come and they've gone and evolved into something else over the years, and of course it's sad that it's a mystery to us, but they clearly knew there was a power about the landscape, there was a power of the landscape of Britain. And I mean, I think it's interesting in the New Age realm, some people often describe Britain as being the heart chakra of the world. I think Simon Peter Fuller speaks of that. And I kind of quite like that, because I think there is a feeling that there's something here where the land itself is important. And the stones that we have and all of that in the crop circles, they call attention to that. But the landscape itself, it has an energy, it has a power about it. And all the myths and legends of the Holy Grail and King Arthur and all of that, I think are speaking of that. And what I thought was very interesting was when a year or two back, the government was talking about selling off the forests. And now I understand that there is a conspiracy theory here that they never really intended to do it. They were just kind of trying to invent something they could appear to do a U-turn on that didn't really matter, so that people didn't notice they weren't U-turning on other things. But that's another story. When the government were talking about selling off our forests, basically, to foreign investors, it's like they didn't quite understand why there was such a savage reaction back against that. Because if you look at the King Arthur legend, the people and the land and the king are one and the same. Now, this doesn't mean I'm coming over all royalist here, but in terms of the legends, the symbolism, we are very, very linked with the land. And the fact that they were just talking about selling it off to make a cheap profit really touched something very, very deep in the heart of British people, and English people in particular. And I thought that was very telling, that there was a real gut reaction of, hang on a minute, this is ours? You are selling off our legacy, our history here. And I think the kickback against that was very, very real. And it goes to show that, you know, there is more to this nation than just, a collection of, different societies and classes. It goes much, much deeper than that. And I think the race memory, if you like, of our deep past is still very, very powerful here.
I actually think that there's more than a race memory of our past. I actually think that the regardless of immigration, I believe that the phenotype is altered by its surroundings, and regardless of our cultural heritage, if we are of this island, if we eat its fruits, if we drink its water, if we are exposed to its wind, its rain and its sun, then we become of the island.
Oh yeah, no, listen, don't misunderstand me. I 100% agree with your statement there. Of course we are. And it doesn't, Britain's a collection of people from all over the world. There's Norse blood, there's, the Normans, sooner or later different people show up, and of course they become part of the nation, and that is as true today as it ever was. And you're quite right, we become imbibed with what was always powerful and alive here. And it's a shame that we lose some of our older traditions. Because I think they carry a thread back to the very deep past. I was actually brought up in Lewes, in East Sussex. Some people may know that Lewes is a very well known for its bonfire celebrations. It has the biggest Guy Fawkes commemorations in the whole of the nation. It's all a bit controversial. There's all sorts of religious symbolism in it and that. And yet, some of the more recent archaeology seems to suggest that Lewes was originally a series of ancient mounds as large as Silbury Hill. There's still 3 of them left. Others were there and have been removed over the centuries. And if you look back at the kind of rituals that people think thing took place back then, rolling wheels of fire and pageantry and costumes. It's interesting to see that's still going on in Lewis today, albeit in a different guise. But again, it's like the people that have arrived there in the centuries since all that went on have somehow resonated with the old rituals. They've picked up on them again. And so whoever comes along, it's like picks up on that ancient resonance. It doesn't matter where they're from in the world. Once they come here with an intention to be part of this nation, it's like something deeper connects. And that may well be true, and I'm sure it is in other countries, but there is certainly a flavour here that is particularly strong. And I think we should never forget.
Well, you were saying about the forgetting of tribal traditions, but what I was actually going to point out there was having sort of grown up with and been intrinsically part of the dance revolution, the rave culture, as it's often referred to now.
Sure.
My experience of the underground, the sort of underground rave scene, was that it was unbelievably tribal. It was unbelievably shamanic. You would have individuals in the group assuming the roles, the traditional roles of shaman and dancer and medicine man and
absolutely. I mean, I wasn't part of that culture, but I can see from the outside that it absolutely was tapping into that. Yeah, very much so.
And having actually experienced some of that myself in some of my own kind of psychedelic travels, I would claim to have interacted with that very spirit of this island that you talk about, and felt its magnificence and its resonance, I suppose.
Which is, of course, maybe why they so sort of severely tried to wipe out that whole rave culture. There was such an authoritarian kickback against it, wasn't there? So, yeah, maybe there's something deeper behind all of that.
Yeah, it was my mates that was actually responsible for instigating that with bloody Castle Morton.
But yeah, no, I think you're touching on something very important. I mean, there's a guy called Jez Hughes, who's a friend of mine, but he is, if you like, a modern shaman. He gives talks and demonstrations and workshops, and he's absolutely convinced that, in having lost with the fuzz of modern technology around us and everything, with having sort of lost that connection with nature and the world, it's like we are missing something that's been very important. And he thinks if we can come back into balance with that, that will, I think, bring us to sort of a better state of consciousness. Because I think, there is a truth to that. We are still, and maybe this will change in centuries to come, but right now we are still, I think, a very strong part of this country and of nature and everything that brings into our consciousness. And the more we're sort of sucked into just watching EastEnders every night or whatever it may be, the further we get from that. And I think there is a balance to be struck, and we need to be very, very careful. So, yeah, I think that to have an awareness of the importance of these kinds of things will help us move into the future. I think just to shut off the past and say, well, we're in a technological society now, I'll put my brain chip in and off we go, I think is dangerous, obviously, and for other reasons as well. But I think we need to keep a perspective, keeping the past and the future sort of blended together.
And I think, again, in a solutions-based sort of construct, another thing that people can do, which ties into what you were saying about our kind of innate protective nature about our woodlands, and also this kind of spirit of England, is if you want something to do, plant a yew tree and plant an apple tree. If you have done those two things in your life, and I've still yet to do one of them, I've planted fucking thousands of apple trees. I'm bloody working on apple farms over the years, but if you can plant an apple tree and plant a yew tree in your lifetime, then you will have put back most of the materials that your life will have consumed.
Well, that's something I shall bear in mind. I mean, I know that yew is very sacred, and of course yew trees, they live for so long. Some of the yew trees are some of the oldest sort of living things, aren't they, I do believe.
Recently doubled in age, according to the scientific estimates, because unfortunately you can't core date a yew tree because they grow hollow.
That's very interesting.
And
well, yes,
what
they
used the line drawings, the artist's line drawings of churchyards, and they animated them into a 3D wireframe grid into a computer, and then animated them backwards, as it were, shrinking them back in a time by using multiple line drawings of artist line drawings of churchyards over the centuries. And they essentially had to double the age, the claimed age of most of the ewes that they were examining, and some of them went back 4,000 years.
Well, that is very interesting indeed.
And
of course,
to add to
as
that,
I understand it, a lot of the more ancient churches always had a yew tree somewhere in the church.
Well, this is it. The yew trees are now known to have pre-existed most of those churchyards by at least 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And not only that, but to add to that, a yew tree is most happy growing in the rotting hulk of its parent. So it may well be that a single generation, a single species, a single family of yew tree, mother and daughter, may have stood on that site for tens of thousands of years.
Indeed so. Well, I mean, as we know, many of the churches were built on ancient sites, that were already sacred long before the churches came along. So that's very interesting because, yes, as you say, that takes it back even further. Yeah, fascinating.
Excuse me, coughing fit.
That's okay.
Funnily enough, I actually had a map where I had mapped nearly all of the yew trees in East Sussex and plotted their girth. That was, funnily enough, involved in one of my time slips as well. I slipped a sort of 150 years into the past, and particularly yew tree was part of that experience as well.
Well, I mean, I think there are so many mysteries around us, and I think part of what holds us in this kind of normality is, certainly I think we've been trained to believe that you can't slip outside of it. And so, of course, we don't, because after a while we actually shut ourselves off, I think, to other possibilities of existence. And I think that's what's very important about the times we're in now, is that I sense that people are beginning to actually say, hang on a minute, why can't I consider that anything's possible? They're telling us all these amazing things about the Higgs boson and quantum and all that, and yet in the same breath they're telling us that nothing metaphysical can occur. It doesn't add up and it doesn't make sense.
Well, that particular story, I actually came back with a completely independent, corroboratable piece of data, which when I presented the only human on the planet that had any relevance to, i.e. the vicar who currently occupied the rectory for that particular parish, I was able to describe the pre-existing rectory, even though he knew the only photo to be in existence to be in the dusty loft, and that he'd only seen it the once when he'd first moved in and had happened across it, and he went white and very nearly passed out on the spot when I was describing this burnt down rectory in absolute perfect detail.
Very interesting.
And that actually came about because of me wanting to measure the yew tree. He happened to be mowing the lawn in the front garden of the rectory, so I thought it might seem a little strange, me vaulting his wall and measuring his yew tree to add to my map. So I thought I'd better sort of call him over. And in the discussion, the talk about the yew tree, I suddenly realised that I knew what house used to be next to it from this sort of this experience that I'd had several months before.
Well, I'm certainly open to that, and I mean, over the years I've talked to other people who claim to have had time slips. There was a chap I know who was driving, I believe, somewhere around the Storrington area, and suddenly, as he was driving, it was as if the roads and everything dissolved around him, and he was suddenly in a village, and for a minute he thought he'd sort of like gone to some, costume recreation of old times, until he just realised he literally had gone back like 200 years, and the people were wandering around just as they were. And then as he watched it gradually faded back, and before he knew it, there he was just back in normality. And I suspect this kind of thing goes on more than we know. But again, a lot of people are afraid to discuss experiences like this because the rest of the population has been trained to basically ridicule them.
Yeah. But not only that, but that programming is so strong that in fact that was the case for me during the actual experience. One of the sort of funny things about it was that I could see in through the window of the pub, as I'm walking around in this experience, and the light being cast out of the window of the pub is really dingy and yellow. And I remember noticing that first and thinking, pubs must have a power cut or something. And then when I look in through the window, I see all these people sitting around in like sort of yokel felt cloth caps and smocks. And I think, for God's sakes, they must be having a folk night down there, and they've got the whole place candle lit. It never occurred to me for one moment at the time that I was actually not in my own time. And the same way, the road was cobbled, and I knew the road to be tarmacked, and my actual thought at the time was that the council, in some effort to make Lamberhurst, this was Lamberhurst Village, to make Lamberhurst somehow more yoldy-weldy, that they'd come in and strip the tarmac off the cobbles. And I was thinking, oh my God, that's going to be a nightmare in the winter, because it's a big squiggly sort of S-bended hill going down the A21. And so it didn't occur to me for one moment that the road couldn't possibly have been returned to cobbles. It was just, I could see that the road was now cobbles. I knew it to be tarmacked. I had no idea that I wasn't now. So
that raises an interesting point, which is that, of course, maybe somebody sitting in that tavern or whatever, whenever it was, several hundred years ago, might have seen you as a ghost.
Or even walking up the road in my modern garb and thinking that they'd just seen an alien.
Indeed. I mean, this is something, again, that I come across very often after I've given a presentation and I've talked about all the weird stuff. So often people will share ghost stories. And often these are not people that are generally going to be given to fantasizing. The more ghost stories I hear, the more ridiculous I realise it is when people like Richard Dawkins say, it's all in the mind. It's oxygen starvation. It's hallucination. Because some of these experiences, there's so much verification. And, often many different people will see the same ghost in the same place at different times, not knowing that anybody else has seen it. And that's not just one thing in one person's mind. There's something clearly recurring there which is triggering the same images. So, there is a real phenomenon here, whether it's, people from the past or the future coming to now so that we can see them, or us doing the same, like maybe could have happened to you there. Us being seen as ghosts, I think that the doorways between realms, times, dimensions, it doesn't mean that much. It's only because we think it does, because we've been told so many times that such things can't happen, that we've got into this rigid thinking, so we dismiss things that actually may be very important. And certainly when you look at the statistics of people who have experiences like that, you realise there really is a whole other world going on here. For sure, even if you write off 3/4 of it as fantasy, hallucination or whatever, you've still got millions and millions of experiences that you just cannot explain away.
Absolutely. Mine included. I mean, that was probably part of my epiphany, really, was some of those experiences just broke my SI model so utterly and completely, and unexpectedly as well. Had it have been something that I'd been seeking, had it have been, an experiment. I'm a temporal lobe epileptic. And had it have been part of one of my sort of psychedelic voyages, had it have been, I'd taken a mushroom trip to see if I could go back in time, then I could be a bit more dismissive of it. But this was completely unbidden and completely unbelieved on my part. And this is the other thing that seems to be the case with these experiences, is that they're largely not even believed by the experiencer. The only reason why I'm so convinced that what has happened to me is true is because most times I have ended up with this externally delivered corroboration. It's not even like I've been seeking out the proof. The proof has come to me and presented itself to me, and it's been as much of a shock to me to be presented with that. When I told the vicar, I was almost as white as a sheet as he was, because I suddenly realised that experience must have been real.
Yes.
Whereas before then it had just been some illusory something that had happened to me one time when I'd had a fit.
Well, of course, it may well be that, what we call sort of like an ailment or a condition or whatever is in fact a gift. That I think.
Oh, absolutely.
And just treated as such. They were the shamans. They were the soothsayers. Today,
and that is, and funnily enough, that is how my peer group have treated me ever since I was a small boy. People would come to me for advice, and I would wonder what on earth they thought I could possibly have to offer them. in the way of advice, and I would do my very best to think about what they'd asked me and to give them my very best advice. But it just... And now one of my eldest boys is now finding that he's in a much older peer group, and yet this older peer group are coming to him as some kind of a vizier. It's most peculiar.
Well, and I think that's a really important observation to make. So, I think we've got into these things of, if somebody's a bit strange, you push them to the fringes, or you put them on Ritalin or whatever it may be. I think we've got to come out of that and embrace the differences in people, however eccentric they may seem, within reason.
I spent years trying to medicate myself, through doctors and through self-medication, medicate myself out of my various abilities before realising that they were exactly that they were abilities and not bloody disabilities.
Yes. Well, it's like anything. You have to strike a happy balance. And, you do what you need to do to make yourself feel comfortable. But if you're trying to force change upon yourself to suit somebody else's idea and what they think you should be, and it feels wrong, then you're going down the wrong path. But unfortunately, I think that does happen a lot. And again, because we're so afraid of going against the norm, of challenging the status quo, particularly when doctors tell us things, I think a lot of people tend to go down avenues that they're not really comfortable with because they don't think that it's the right thing to dare challenge that. But I'd like to hope, and I am from the people I see around me, that is changing. That is beginning to shift, and people are now beginning to take more responsibility for themselves and be more open-minded that there are other ways of being. And that the so-called authority figures that have got used to kind of ordering us and telling us what our life should be may not always be right. And again, it's striking the balance, it's trying to discern where the middle ground of that lies.
What a beautiful summation of a 3-hour show, Andy. I would love to have you back on as a guest if you'd have me.
Oh, it'd be a pleasure anytime. That's been very enjoyable.
It has been a laugh. From the dialogue in the chat box, it sounds like absolutely everybody's been enjoying it. So
that's great.
a hugely informative discussion, I think, on a broad range of subjects. And again, I just love this bringing a degree of reason to all of these subjects. Is something that we have to really concentrate on because there is so much unreasonableness about many of them.
Yeah, for sure. Well, listen, if anybody is curious to know more about my stuff, just have a look at the website, truthagenda.org, or look up the Truth Agenda on Amazon or something. And, if people are interested in this kind of stuff, it's a good starting point. So.
Okay, absolutely. How many books have you actually got in print?
Well, over the years, probably something like 12. Some of these have been about psychic stuff, a lot of crop circle stuff. There's 5 books, believe it or not, and then the Truth Agenda. And I've also done some books about local history as well, particularly around Lewis and Brighton, which is where I hailed from originally. So that's a whole other side. I'm very interested in the local history of this area. So, yeah, if people look on the web, they'll find all sorts of links to stuff about books that I've put out over the years. But the Truth Agenda certainly is the one that at the moment kind of gathers all this kind of stuff together that we've been discussing today. So if anyone's curious, take a look.
You want to give that web address out again?
Yeah, it's www.truthagenda.org, O-R-G, truthagenda.org.
Excellent. And I think we'll possibly book you for a 3-hour show for the next 2 or 3 months. Would that be okay?
Yeah, no, hopefully people listening in that found something useful here. I hope so, and I've certainly been honoured to be here, so thank you.
No, you're absolutely welcome, Andy. It's been an absolute blast. Right, I'll play a tune out, and I'll just say goodbye to you off air, so... this is Kanaska with Caged Mind. This has been Freeman Jack and Andy Thomas on TNS Radio. That's www.tnsradio.ning.com. I'm sure you all knew that anyway. Right, see you on Thursday night. It'll be now with me and Super Dubs for some tunes. See you later, folks.
Things got realistic, fridge filled with fish sticks. The vaccine wishless made their kids autistic. Nothing's too degrading in this zombie generation. For fauna devastation, only plastic compensation. Drunk hailing taxis for a soft pad like Maxis. You're not your fucking khakis, ditch them like no backsies. Pendulum swinging half speed in the cage of your rap sheet. Welcome to the bloodstream or the age of the trash heap. Buy this, then buy that. Buy shit, then buy crap. Buy by thinking cap, you don't appear in this act. Strapped to a rack, both hands behind my back. The Fed flipped the dollar to a Chinese finger trap. But I got a knife attached to the side of my bootstrap. I am mutiny to Ahab, the white whale he couldn't stab. The fact of the matter is in the manner I rap. I'ma teach these new jacks the way to skip that cat.
We are slaves to materialism, and we are slaves to consumerism, and we are slaves to buying shit that we don't need. Go back to sleep, 'cause your government loves you.
The left to the Red Sea, rich folk dying, poisoning their food and they're caged in minds. Go to the movies, entertain away your time, or go to the mall to buy some shit you don't need to buy. They don't want you to think, they keep you entertained. They don't want you to find the answer, just stay in pain. Control over population is a major game. Distractions like pornographic images in the brain.
It relies upon terror and oppression, controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedom.
Ooh, yeah, we are slaves to this game, trained to remain in this frame of mind, so we behave in a way they can predict and line us up before they take the shot. Put a sick design, because they tell you to shop, but you're only selling your time for all that worthless fucking shit you never needed to buy. You've been deceived by a lie, so we need you to realize that you gotta wake up and see this world to realize.
We are slaves to materialism, and we are slaves to consumerism, and we are slaves to buying shit that we don't need. Go back to sleep, 'cause your government loves you.
Dirty sex, show you clips of clits and phallic. Teach you to hate Muslims, Jews, French, or Gaelic. Show no peace and say you need to panic. Buy shit we don't need, abuse the planet. Yeah. Take a seat, son, sit and listen. It's a shame we slaves to materialism. Break the chains, take a shit in this prison. They fuck with your brain like an acid trip. They own your ass when they put your ass in debt. No assets left, who you gonna ask for help? When they take your food, your fridge, your last glass of milk. The devil hide the truth and mask it well. Who do you trust? Just ask yourself.